Hey everyone, welcome to Dr. Sleep. We love creating unique content for you, but we need your support now more than ever. Our channel is facing some challenges, and we really need your interaction. If you enjoy what we offer, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share our videos with your friends. Every comment, like, and share makes a huge difference. Let's grow together and keep bringing you the content you care about. Thank you for your continued support. The Appalachian Mountains stretched before Alex in a breathtaking expanse of green and gray, their peaks rolling like the waves of a frozen ocean. This was his first hunt in the region, though he was no stranger to the wilderness. At 30, Alex had spent nearly half his life in the woods, hunting deer and elk, honing his skills with his trusted rifle and sidearm. But the Appalachians were different. Older, wilder, and steeped in stories he'd always dismissed as local lore. He parked his truck at the edge of a dirt trail, slinging his rifle over his shoulder and securing his sidearm at his hip. The air smelled clean but carried an undercurrent of damp earth and decay, the scent of an ancient forest. His plan was simple: hike deep into the woods, set up camp, and track deer at dawn. The locals had warned him about the labyrinthine trails and advised against straying too far, but Alex welcomed the challenge. By mid-afternoon, Alex had ventured several miles into the wilderness. The trail was narrow and overgrown, the trees towering above him like cathedral columns. The forest was alive with the sound of birds and rustling leaves, but something felt off. It wasn't the terrain. He'd hiked rougher trails before, but the forest's oppressive atmosphere. The deeper he ventured, the more the world seemed to close in around him, the trees pressing closer, their twisted branches forming jagged shadows. That's when he saw it, a face, faint and fleeting, etched into the bark of a massive oak tree. Alex stopped, blinking, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his sidearm. The face was gone. He took a step closer, examining the bark. There was nothing but the natural grooves and knots of the wood. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. But as he continued, more faces began to appear. They were never clear, always at the edge of his vision, subtle shifts in the bark that seemed to follow him. At first he dismissed it as a trick of the light, his mind playing games. Yet, as the sun began to dip lower, the faces seemed to grow more distinct, their expressions carved in silent anguish. He tried to distract himself by focusing on his surroundings. Carved into several trees were strange symbols, circles, lines, and intersecting patterns that resembled ancient runes. They weren't the kind of marks left by hunters or hikers. Some were deep gouges, others shallow scratches, but all of them radiated an air of malevolence. Alex stopped again, this time to make camp. The light was fading quickly, and he knew better than to navigate unfamiliar woods at night. He pitched his tent in a small clearing and lit a fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the surrounding trees. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. As night fell, the forest grew unnervingly quiet, the usual symphony of insects and nocturnal animals absent. Alex stared into the fire, gripping his rifle tightly. The faces and symbols lingered in his mind, a warning he couldn't decipher. Something about this place wasn't right, and he was only beginning to understand how deep that wrongness went. Alex woke to a forest shrouded in mist. The morning air was cold and damp, clinging to his skin like a second layer. He hadn't slept well, his dreams plagued by disjointed images of trees twisting into grotesque shapes and faces emerging from the darkness. He shook off the lingering unease and packed up his gear, determined to make the most of the day. As he trekked deeper into the woods, the symbols on the trees became more frequent and intricate. Some were shallow etchings, others carved so deeply the bark had peeled away entirely, revealing raw, pale wood underneath. A few of the designs seemed to pulsate with an almost hypnotic rhythm, drawing his gaze longer than he intended. He shook his head to clear it and pressed on. The faces returned, this time more defined. They seemed to shift and stretch as he moved past, their anguished expressions frozen in silent screams. Alex stopped, heart pounding, and scanned the area. The forest was unnaturally still. No birds chirped, no leaves rustled, just an oppressive silence that made the hair on his neck stand on end. "Hello?" he called, his voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. No answer. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward, his rifle at the ready. The further he went, the more he felt the forest was alive, watching, waiting. Every snap of a twig beneath his boots felt amplified, echoing in the stillness. He considered turning back, but dismissed the thought. He wasn't the kind of man to scare easily, and he wasn't about to let a few strange sights ruin his trip. By midday, the trail had all but disappeared, swallowed by the dense undergrowth. Alex pulled out his compass only to find the needle spinning erratically. He tapped it against his hand, frowning. It didn't make sense. He hadn't wandered far enough for magnetic interference to be an issue. The nearest iron deposits were miles away, according to his research. The sensation of being watched grew stronger. Every now and then he'd catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of his eye, shadows darting between the trees. When he turned to look, there was nothing. He quickened his pace, his hand never straying far from his sidearm. Then he found it. A clearing. In its center stood a crude stone altar, its surface dark and stained with something he didn't want to identify. Around it were poles adorned with deer skulls, their hollow eyes staring at him. Some had antlers that branched impossibly wide, twisting like the gnarled limbs of the trees. Alex's stomach churned. This wasn't some old hunter's camp or a relic from settlers. It felt deliberate, recent. The ground around the altar was disturbed, as if a group of people had gathered here not long ago. He crouched to examine the tracks, barefoot, dozens of them, leading in all directions. The forest seemed to close in around him, the air growing heavier. He straightened, scanning the tree line, his instincts screaming danger. That's when he heard it. A faint, rhythmic chanting carried on the wind. It was low and guttural, words he couldn't understand, but felt deep in his bones. Alex gripped his rifle tighter. He was no longer alone in these woods. Alex crouched low, his heart pounding as the chanting grew louder. It was coming from deeper within the forest, beyond the clearing. The rhythmic tones carried an unnatural weight, as if the very air vibrated with their sound. He debated his options. Every fiber of his being told him to leave, to retrace his steps and get out of the woods while he still could. But curiosity, tinged with a hunter's instinct for tracking, anchored him to the spot. He moved cautiously around the clearing, his boots silent against the mossy ground. His eyes scanned the forest, searching for movement, while his ears strained to pick up any sound beyond the chanting. The deer skulls mounted on poles seemed to follow him, their empty sockets filled with malice. He avoided looking at the altar, the dark stains on its surface making his stomach twist. The tracks around the clearing became more apparent as he studied them. Barefoot impressions, each set pointing toward a single direction, where the chanting originated. The prints were too large for children and too erratic to be from seasoned hikers. They weaved in strange patterns as if the people who left them had danced or shuffled in unison. Alex hesitated, then followed the tracks. The forest grew darker as he moved, the trees so tightly packed they blocked out the sun. The symbols on their trunks became more frequent and detailed. Some looked like crude faces, others spirals or jagged shapes that made his eyes ache if he stared too long. A foul smell began to permeate the air, a mix of decay and something sharp, almost metallic. Then he saw them. At first it was just movement, a flicker of robes slipping between the trees. He froze, crouching behind a thick trunk, his rifle at the ready. He waited, his breath shallow as the figures came into view. They wore long, tattered robes of deep red, their faces obscured by hoods. On their heads were deer skulls, complete with massive antlers that looked far too large for the human necks supporting them. Alex counted 5 of them, each moving in a slow, deliberate procession. They carried long staffs, the ends adorned with feathers, bones, and what looked disturbingly like hair. They moved toward another clearing ahead where the chanting was louder now, almost deafening. He crept closer, every step calculated. As he reached the edge of the second clearing, the full scene unfolded before him. A large stone altar stood in the center, similar to the one he'd seen earlier but far larger. Around it were more robed figures, at least a dozen, all chanting in unison. Their voices created a dissonant harmony that set his teeth on edge. At the altar's base, an intricate circle had been carved into the dirt, filled with the same strange symbols he'd seen on the trees. Within it, something writhed, a small, dark shape that Alex couldn't quite make out from his vantage point. He squinted, trying to get a clearer look, when a branch snapped beneath his boot. The chanting stopped. The robed figures turned as one, their skull-faced masks staring directly at him. Alex's blood ran cold. The forest around him fell silent, save for the sound of his own rapid breathing. Alex's instincts took over, and he ducked behind the nearest tree, gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles ached. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, drowning out the oppressive silence that followed the snap of the branch. He peeked around the trunk, only to see the figures in their crimson robes spreading out, their skull-masked faces sweeping the forest. They were looking for him. Moving carefully, Alex began to retreat, keeping low and using the thick underbrush for cover. His training as a hunter gave him the edge. He knew how to move silently, even in terrain like this. But something about these people unsettled him. They didn't search like ordinary men. Their movements were methodical, almost synchronized, as though they were guided by a shared mind. A guttural sound split the air, a harsh, animalistic cry that reverberated through the woods. Alex froze, his stomach twisting. It wasn't human. He couldn't place the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once, carried on the wind. His breath quickened as he glanced around, his fingers brushing the grip of his sidearm. The robed figures stopped, their heads tilting in unison toward the source of the cry. Then, without warning, they moved as one, turning and disappearing into the forest's shadows. Alex remained frozen, his eyes darting between the trees, his muscles tense and ready to fire. But the figures didn't return. Only after several long, agonizing minutes did he begin to breathe again. He didn't stop retreating until he was sure he'd put significant distance between himself and the altar. The forest felt different now, darker, more alive. Every shadow seemed to shift, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. He found a small rise in the terrain and climbed to its top, setting up a temporary camp where he could have a clearer view of his surroundings. Night fell quickly, and with it came a biting cold. Alex huddled near a small fire, his rifle within arm's reach. He tried to rationalize what he'd seen. Maybe it was some strange Appalachian ritual, a local tradition he didn't understand. But the bloodstains on the altar, the masks, the chanting, none of it felt like folklore. It felt like danger. Sleep eluded him at first, but exhaustion eventually won. He drifted into a fitful slumber, only to find himself trapped in a vivid nightmare. In the dream, the faces on the trees were no longer subtle. They emerged fully formed, their mouths open in silent screams as their eyes followed his every move. The forest floor turned to mud beneath his feet, pulling him down with each step. Figures in red robes emerged from the darkness, their deer skull masks gleaming in the moonlight. They reached for him, their hands claw-like, dragging him toward a massive stone altar that loomed impossibly tall. When he woke, his heart was hammering, his body drenched in sweat. The fire had burned low, and the forest was cloaked in an unnatural silence. His instincts told him he wasn't alone. He grabbed his rifle and scanned the area, his pulse racing. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, a figure in a red robe stood motionless, its skull mask glinting faintly in the dying firelight. Alex's grip tightened on his rifle as he stared at the motionless figure in the red robe. It was standing at the edge of the tree line, just close enough for him to make out the grotesque antlers sprouting from its skull mask. The figure didn't move, but Alex could feel its gaze boring into him, even from this distance. He raised the rifle, centering the figure in his sights. His finger hovered over the trigger. But as he adjusted his aim, the figure turned and disappeared silently into the forest, swallowed by the darkness. Alex's breath came in shallow bursts as he scanned the area, his eyes darting between the trees. He was a skilled hunter, but this wasn't like tracking deer or elk. These people, if they were people, moved with an unnatural silence, as though the forest itself conspired to mask their movements. He extinguished the fire and packed up his camp quickly, moving deeper into the woods. He couldn't afford to stay in one place, not when he was being hunted. His every step felt heavy, the forest pressing in around him. The faces on the trees were no longer faint impressions. They were grotesque and detailed, their expressions frozen in agony, and their eyes seemed to follow him with every step. Hours passed as Alex tried to put distance between himself and the cult. The sun never fully broke through the dense canopy, leaving the forest in a perpetual twilight. He stopped when he stumbled upon another clearing, his stomach sinking at what he saw. This one was larger than the first. Its centerpiece a massive stone altar adorned with crimson cloth and intricate carvings. The carvings were similar to the symbols on the trees, but far more complex, etched deep into the stone. The ground surrounding the altar was trampled, the soil dark and disturbed. He crouched low, scanning the area for any sign of movement, but the clearing was empty. For now. Alex approached cautiously, his rifle raised. He noticed small objects scattered near the altar, animal bones, charred remnants of what might have been candles, and crude wooden figurines carved into grotesque shapes. His stomach turned as he examined the area further. Near the base of the altar, he spotted scraps of fabric, a torn hiking jacket, a piece of nylon from a backpack. They weren't old. Someone had been here recently. As he scanned the clearing, his eyes caught something chilling. Hanging from a low branch was a crude talisman fashioned from twigs, feathers, and what looked like human hair. It swayed gently, though there was no breeze. He reached up to grab it, but as his fingers brushed the object, a sound froze him in place. The chanting had returned. Low and guttural, it resonated through the forest, coming from somewhere beyond the clearing. It was rhythmic, the kind of sound that made his skin crawl. He ducked into the shadows, positioning himself behind a thick tree trunk as he watched the edge of the clearing. The chanting grew louder, closer. Then from the darkness they emerged. A procession of robed figures stepped into the clearing, their movements eerily synchronized. At their center, two of them carried something heavy. A person. Alex's breath caught in his throat as he realized it was a woman. She was unconscious, her arms and legs bound with thick rope, her head lolled to the side, her face pale. They were heading toward the altar. Alex's muscles tensed as he assessed the situation. There were too many of them to take head-on, even with his rifle. He had one advantage. They didn't know he was there. He watched as they placed the woman on the altar, their chanting reaching a fever pitch. His mind raced. He had to do something, and fast. Alex's pulse hammered as he watched the cultists surround the altar. The woman lay motionless on the stone slab, her chest rising and falling faintly. Whatever they had done to her, she was alive, for now. The robed figures moved with eerie precision, their antlered skull masks gleaming in the dim light as they chanted in guttural tones. He counted at least a dozen of them, too many for a direct confrontation, but he couldn't leave her there. He shifted slightly, gripping his rifle tighter, the stock pressing into his shoulder. He needed to act, but his hunter's instincts told him to wait for the perfect moment. The chanting stopped abruptly. One of the figures stepped forward, taller than the rest, with a more elaborate set of antlers crowning his mask. The leader. In his hands, he held a curved blade, its edge glinting ominously. The others knelt, lowering their heads in reverence as the leader approached the altar. He raised the blade high, and the air seemed to vibrate with unseen energy. "No time," Alex muttered under his breath. He steadied his aim, centering the rifle's sight on the leader's chest. Taking a deep breath, he squeezed the trigger. The crack of the gunshot shattered the oppressive silence, reverberating through the forest. The leader staggered, clutching his chest as he crumpled to the ground. For a moment, the clearing was frozen in shock. Then chaos erupted. The robed figures turned toward the tree line, their movements frantic as they searched for the source of the shot. Alex didn't hesitate. He fired again, dropping another cultist before slinging his rifle over his shoulder and drawing his sidearm. He dashed toward the altar, his boots pounding against the earth. The cultists moved to intercept him, but they were slow, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated compared to his. He dropped two more with precise shots, their bodies crumpling into the dirt. One lunged at him, swinging a staff adorned with bones and feathers. Alex sidestepped the blow and fired, the figure collapsing mid-swing. Reaching the altar, he holstered his sidearm and quickly untied the woman. Her eyes fluttered open, hazy with confusion. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice urgent. I think so," she stammered, her voice weak. He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as she swayed unsteadily. The remaining cultists regrouped, their guttural chants rising once more. This time the sound was sharper, more aggressive. Alex glanced back and saw them advancing, their movements quicker now, more determined. "Move!" he barked, pulling the woman toward the tree line. The two of them plunged into the forest, Alex's rifle slung over his shoulder, his sidearm ready in his hand. The cultists gave chase, their chants echoing through the trees like a war cry. The woman stumbled and Alex caught her, practically dragging her forward. "You need to keep up," he urged. "We can't stop." "I'm trying," she panted, her voice strained. The forest seemed to conspire against them, the dense undergrowth snagging their clothes and slowing their escape. Alex fired blindly over his shoulder, the flashes of his gun briefly illuminating the twisted faces of their pursuers. For every cultist he slowed down, two more seemed to emerge from the darkness. The forest closed in around them as Alex and the woman stumbled through the dense undergrowth. The cultists were relentless, their guttural chants ringing out behind them like a predatory howl. Alex's heart pounded, adrenaline surging through his veins as he half-dragged, half-supported the woman who struggled to keep pace. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "I don't know," Alex replied through gritted teeth, "but they're not going to stop." A flash of red caught his eye and he spun, firing his sidearm. The shot rang out and a robed figure dropped to the ground with a sickening thud. The others hesitated momentarily, their masks gleaming like pale ghosts in the moonlight, before resuming their pursuit. "We have to find higher ground," Alex said, pulling her up a narrow incline. His hunter's instinct screamed at him to gain a vantage point, somewhere they could regroup and plan their next move. The incline was steep and slippery, the loose soil giving way beneath their boots. Alex pushed the woman forward, his rifle slung across his back as he scrambled up the slope. His lungs burned with effort, but he didn't dare stop. The chanting grew louder, closer. Finally, they reached a rocky outcrop overlooking the forest. Alex turned and raised his rifle, scanning the tree line for movement. The woman collapsed beside him, gasping for air. "They'll find us here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not if I find them first," Alex replied, his tone grim. He spotted movement below, a group of figures weaving through the trees, their red robes fluttering like bloodied banners. He fired, the rifle's sharp crack echoing through the forest. One cultist fell, then another. The remaining figures scattered, ducking behind trees for cover. "They're flanking us," Alex muttered, his eyes narrowing. He turned to the woman. "Can you hold this?" He handed her his sidearm, and she hesitated before taking it. "Point and shoot," he said, "only if they get close." She nodded, her hands trembling as she gripped the weapon. Alex focused on the figures below, his hunter's precision taking over. He picked off another cultist, but there were too many, and they moved with an unnatural fluidity, closing the distance with alarming speed. "They're coming!" the woman shouted, pointing toward the slope. Several cultists were climbing toward them, their antlers swaying like grotesque crowns. Alex grabbed a loose rock and hurled it down the incline, knocking one climber off balance. Another lunged at him, and he swung the butt of his rifle, connecting with a sickening crunch. The figure crumpled, rolling back down the slope. "We can't stay here," Alex said, pulling the woman to her feet. "We need to keep moving." They scrambled down the opposite side of the outcrop, their descent perilous but necessary. The cultists followed, their chants now a chaotic cacophony that seemed to reverberate through the very ground. The forest grew darker and denser, the trees so tightly packed they formed a nearly impenetrable wall. Alex pushed forward, his every muscle screaming in protest. He had no plan, only the primal drive to survive. Finally, they emerged into another clearing, this one eerily silent. In the center stood a crude wooden structure, half collapsed and overgrown with moss. Alex's eyes darted around, searching for signs of more cultists, but the area seemed abandoned. "We'll rest here," he said, his voice ragged. "Just for a moment." The woman nodded, sinking to the ground. Alex positioned himself near the edge of the clearing, his rifle ready. The silence was unnerving, but for now, it was their only reprieve. Alex scanned the edge of the clearing, his rifle steady, his eyes sweeping every shadow and movement. The cultists weren't far behind. He could feel it in the oppressive stillness that settled over the forest. Behind him, the woman sat slumped against the wooden structure, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. "We can't stay here long," Alex said, his voice low but firm. If they catch up, we're out of options. Who are these people? She asked again, her voice tinged with fear. Why are they doing this? I don't know, Alex replied, but I know they're not going to stop. As if in response, the guttural chanting resumed in the distance, faint at first but growing louder. The sound sent a chill through Alex's body. It was rhythmic, primal, almost as if the forest itself were alive and joining in the pursuit. They're coming, he muttered, rising to his feet. The woman struggled to stand, leaning heavily on him as they prepared to move. Alex led her toward the tree line, his mind racing. He needed to find a defensible position, somewhere they could hold their ground if necessary. But the forest was working against him. Its density and darkness made every step treacherous. The chanting grew louder, closer. Alex turned back and saw the first of the cultists emerging from the trees, their red robes stark against the shadowy backdrop. Their antlered masks gleamed like malevolent beacons, and their movements were disturbingly synchronized. "Run," Alex said, his voice sharp. They sprinted into the forest, the woman stumbling but keeping pace. Alex fired a shot over his shoulder, the muzzle flash illuminating the twisted faces of their pursuers. A cultist fell, but the others didn't slow. They moved with an unnatural determination, their chants filling the air like a hunting horn. The terrain grew steeper, the ground littered with roots and loose rocks. Alex's boots slipped as he helped the woman climb, their progress slow and arduous. Behind them, the cultists closed in, their chants now a frenzied cacophony. Alex reached the top of a ridge and turned, firing 2 more shots. Another cultist dropped, but the remaining figures were unfazed, their movements relentless. He spotted a narrow ravine ahead and motioned for the woman to follow. "Down here," he called, sliding down the rocky incline. They reached the bottom of the ravine, where a shallow stream trickled over smooth stones. The rushing water provided some cover, masking the sound of their movements. Alex guided the woman along the stream, the icy water soaking their boots. "Are they still behind us?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alex glanced back, his rifle at the ready. The cultists weren't visible, but the chanting continued, echoing through the ravine like a predator's growl. He nodded grimly. They're not giving up. The stream led them to a narrow cave entrance, partially obscured by hanging vines. Alex pushed the foliage aside, revealing a dark tunnel that sloped downward. It wasn't ideal, but it was shelter. "In here," he said, motioning for her to enter. The woman hesitated, staring into the darkness. "Are you sure? We don't have a choice." She nodded and ducked inside, Alex following close behind. He crouched at the entrance, his rifle aimed at the ravine. The chanting grew fainter, but it didn't stop. He knew they wouldn't be safe for long. Inside the cave, the air was damp and cold. Alex lit a small flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. The tunnel stretched deeper into the earth, its walls jagged and uneven. "This should buy us some time," he said, his voice low. "But we can't stay here forever." The woman sank to the ground, her hands trembling. Alex stayed at the entrance, listening. The cultists' chants echoed faintly, a reminder that the hunt wasn't over. The cave was deathly silent except for the faint drip of water echoing from somewhere deep within. Alex kept his rifle trained on the entrance, his finger hovering just above the trigger. The woman sat with her back against the rough stone wall, her breathing shallow but steady. The faint glow of Alex's flashlight cast long shadows, making the space feel more claustrophobic. "They won't stop," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "Will they?" Alex shook his head. "Not until we're out of these woods." They waited, listening to the muffled chanting that ebbed and flowed outside. It felt distant now, but Alex knew better than to relax. He motioned for her to stand, handing her the flashlight. "We're moving," he said. "Stay close and keep quiet." The tunnel sloped downward, twisting and narrowing until they had to crouch to navigate through. The walls were slick with moisture, the air thick with the earthy scent of decay. As they descended deeper into the cave, the chanting faded completely, replaced by an oppressive silence. Finally, the tunnel opened into a wider cavern, its floor scattered with broken rocks and shallow pools of water. A faint light filtered through a jagged opening on the far side, an exit. Relief washed over Alex as he pointed toward it. "Looks like our way out," he said. They moved quickly, climbing over the uneven terrain toward the light. The fresh air was a welcome change from the cave's stale atmosphere. Alex pushed through the opening first, stepping into a narrow valley surrounded by towering cliffs. The forest loomed ahead, dense and uninviting, but he recognized a faint trail cutting through the undergrowth. "This leads somewhere," he said, helping the woman out of the cave. "We follow it until we find help." They moved cautiously, every sound in the forest amplified in the heavy silence. Alex's senses were on high alert, his rifle at the ready. The trail was overgrown but discernible, winding through the trees and gradually sloping upward. After what felt like hours, they reached the crest of a hill. Alex paused, scanning the area. In the distance, a thin plume of smoke rose above the treetops, a ranger station. Relief surged through him. "That's our way out," he said, pointing toward the smoke. "We're close." The woman nodded, her expression a mix of exhaustion and hope. They descended the hill, the trail becoming more defined as they neared the station. For the first time since the ordeal began, Alex felt a glimmer of hope. When they finally reached the station, it was nearly dusk. The small wooden building stood at the edge of a clearing, its windows glowing faintly with warm light. Alex approached cautiously, knocking on the door with the butt of his rifle. A park ranger opened the door, his expression turning to concern as he took in their disheveled appearance. "What happened to you two?" he asked. Alex glanced at the woman, then back at the ranger. "We need to report something. There's a group in the woods, dangerous people." The ranger nodded, ushering them inside. "Let's get you both some water and call the authorities." Inside, the warmth of the station was comforting. Alex and the woman recounted their story as the ranger listened intently, his face growing more serious with each detail. He radioed for backup, assuring them help was on the way. For the first time in hours, Alex allowed himself to relax. They were safe. At least he thought they were. The ranger station was a haven of normalcy compared to the horrors Alex and the woman had just endured. Warm light spilled from the ceiling lamp, illuminating the wooden walls adorned with maps and safety guidelines. Alex sat stiffly in a chair, his rifle resting against the table, while the woman sipped from a steaming mug of tea. The ranger hovered nearby, jotting notes as they recounted their ordeal. "You're saying there's a group of people out there wearing robes and antlers?" the ranger asked, his brow furrowed. "Performing some kind of ritual?" "Yes," Alex said firmly. "They were armed, organized, and dangerous. They were going to kill her." He nodded toward the woman, who clutched the mug with trembling hands. The ranger hesitated, his pen hovering above his notepad. "I've heard stories about strange things in these woods, but this..." He shook his head. "I'll radio this in and get a search team out there. We'll find them." Alex exhaled, tension he hadn't realized he was holding finally easing. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion settling over him like a heavy blanket. They were finally safe. Help was coming. But then the woman gasped, dropping her mug. The ceramic shattered on the floor as she stared at her forearm, her eyes wide with terror. "What is it?" Alex asked, immediately on alert. She held up her arm, revealing a small but intricate tattoo etched into her skin, a circular symbol eerily similar to the ones carved into the trees and stone altars. Alex's stomach twisted as he rolled up his own sleeve. His blood ran cold. There it was. The same symbol, faint but unmistakable, burned into his skin just above his wrist. "No," Alex muttered, his mind racing. "This wasn't here before." The woman's breathing grew rapid, panic overtaking her. "What does it mean? What did they do to us?" The ranger stepped closer, his face a mask of confusion. "Are you saying these markings just appeared?" Alex nodded, his jaw tight. His instincts, honed over years of survival, screamed that this was no coincidence. The cult had marked them, though he didn't know how or why. The radio on the ranger's desk crackled to life, a garbled voice announcing the arrival of backup. The ranger reached for the device, but Alex's attention was fixed on the tattoo. He traced it with his finger, the symbol's meaning eluding him but filling him with a deep, unshakable dread. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and resolute. The woman looked at him, her eyes filled with fear. "What do we do now?" Alex didn't have an answer. The cultists' chants echoed faintly in his memory, a sinister reminder of what they'd escaped, but perhaps not entirely. We stay alive, Alex said finally. And we figure out what this means. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the faint rustle of the forest. Somewhere, deep in the Appalachian wilderness, the cultists were still out there, waiting, watching. Alex gripped his rifle tighter, his resolve hardening. The hunt wasn't over, not for them and not for him. Ethan leaned back in his office chair, staring at the blank screen of his laptop. The blinking cursor mocked him, each flash a reminder of his creative paralysis. He had been a published author for almost a decade, his thrillers and mysteries always earning critical acclaim. But now the ideas just wouldn't come. His wife, Jennifer, leaned on the doorway, her presence a soothing balm to his frustration. "You know," she began, her voice calm, "maybe you need a change of scenery. Go to your uncle's cabin. You used to love it there. It might help clear your head." Ethan nodded, reluctant but desperate. The cabin in the woods had always been his sanctuary. His uncle, a gruff but kind man, had raised him like a son after his parents passed. They'd spent countless weekends hunting in the forest, Ethan learning everything about tracking, survival, and precision shooting. That was years ago, though. The cabin had been abandoned since his uncle disappeared without a trace 5 years earlier. Ethan inherited it, but he hadn't returned since. Jennifer's suggestion was logical. He needed the solitude, and the forest might rekindle some of the inspiration he desperately sought. The couple packed quickly, loading up their SUV with the essentials. Jennifer, ever the planner, ensured they had enough supplies for weeks. Ethan included his trusty hunting rifle and revolver, tools he rarely used these days but felt compelled to bring. The forest might not be as idyllic as he remembered, and predators weren't out of the question. The drive was quiet, the hum of the road and the dense trees gradually replacing the chaos of the city. Jennifer read aloud from one of Ethan's older novels, her soft voice filling the cabin with the memory of his success. Ethan smiled, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He hoped this trip would help him find that spark again. They arrived in the early evening. The cabin stood as Ethan remembered it, nestled within a thicket of trees, its weathered wood blending with the forest. Time had been kind to the structure, but an unsettling silence hung in the air. "This place is isolated," Jennifer observed, stepping out of the car and stretching. "It's perfect for writing, though." Ethan unlocked the door, the creak of the hinges echoing in the stillness. Dust coated the furniture, and the faint scent of aged wood and pine lingered. Memories of his uncle flooded his mind. Gruff laughter, the sharp click of rifle bolts being loaded, and tales of the wilderness. The couple spent the first night settling in. Jennifer cooked a simple dinner while Ethan cleaned the cabin, rediscovering old hunting gear and notebooks left behind. As they sat together by the fire, the crackling flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this trip would be exactly what he needed. Unbeknownst to them, the woods outside watched, silent and patient. Ethan woke early the next morning, the pale light of dawn filtering through the cabin's dusty windows. Jennifer was still asleep, bundled under the thick quilt they'd brought. He glanced at her peaceful face and smiled before grabbing his gear, rifle, boots, and a small pack with essentials. The woods awaited, and despite the years that had passed, the thrill of the hunt still stirred within him. He stepped outside, breathing in the crisp, pine-scented air. The forest was still, almost unnaturally so. The hum of insects, the chirping of birds, the distant rustle of animals, none of it was there. The silence pressed down on him, amplifying the crunch of his boots against the underbrush. It wasn't the first time he'd experienced quiet mornings in the woods, but this felt different, heavy. Ethan shook off the unease and moved deeper into the forest. He followed trails he remembered from his youth, places his uncle had shown him where game was usually plentiful. But hours passed, and he found nothing. No deer tracks, no rabbit burrows, not even the fleeting glimpse of a squirrel. The absence of wildlife was unnerving. Ethan crouched by a small creek, scanning for any sign of activity. The water was clear and cold, but it flowed over stones undisturbed. No footprints, no animals coming to drink. "Strange," he muttered, his voice swallowed by the oppressive quiet. As he ventured further, he stumbled upon something unusual, claw marks gouged into the bark of a tree. They were long and deep, too high up for any normal predator to have made. Ethan ran his fingers over the grooves, frowning. A bear, perhaps? But even bears didn't usually leave marks like these. A few feet away, he found more claw marks, this time on a larger tree. They formed a pattern, deliberate and almost territorial. He glanced around, suddenly feeling exposed, but the forest remained still. The unease from earlier settled in his chest, tightening with each passing minute. Ethan shook his head, trying to dismiss the feeling. This was a forest after all. Strange things happened here. He reminded himself of the hunting trips with his uncle, of how the woods had always seemed mysterious, but never threatening. Still, he decided to head back. His rifle felt heavier in his hands as he retraced his steps, hyper-aware of the silence that followed him like a shadow. The cabin came into view just as the sun began to dip, casting long shadows through the trees. Jennifer greeted him at the door, her face bright. "Any luck?" "Not a thing," he replied, setting his gear down. "It's weirdly quiet out there. Didn't even see tracks." Jennifer shrugged, brushing it off. "Maybe it's just the season. Tomorrow might be better." Ethan forced a smile, but the unease lingered. He didn't tell her about the claw marks. There was no need to worry her, not yet. That night, as they lay in bed, Ethan stared at the ceiling, listening to the oppressive silence outside. Something felt wrong, very wrong. The following morning, Ethan awoke to the sound of Jennifer humming softly in the kitchen. The smell of coffee wafted through the cabin, momentarily easing the tension that had settled in his chest since his hunting trip. For a fleeting moment, life felt normal again. "Morning," Jennifer greeted with a warm smile as Ethan shuffled into the kitchen. "Did you sleep better?" "Not really," he admitted, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Still feels off out there. I'll give it another shot today, though." Jennifer placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch reassuring. "You'll figure it out. Maybe you're just rusty. And hey, if hunting doesn't work out, we can always go hiking later." Ethan nodded, grateful for her optimism. After breakfast, he grabbed his gear and headed into the woods again. The day stretched on much like the previous one. Empty trails, no tracks, and a creeping sense of unease. He decided to try a different area, one he hadn't visited since he was a teenager. As the afternoon wore on, his frustration mounted. Not a single sign of life. No birds, no rabbits, not even insects buzzing around. The forest felt lifeless, like a hollow shell of what it should be. Finally, with the sun beginning to dip, he turned back toward the cabin, rifle slung over his shoulder. The sight that greeted him upon his return froze him in his tracks. The door to the cabin was ajar, the wood splintered around the lock. Jagged claw marks marred the frame, deep and deliberate, as though something had tried to rip the door off its hinges. His heart hammered in his chest as he dropped his pack and bolted inside. "Jennifer," he called, his voice echoing through the small cabin. Silence answered him. He searched every room, his panic growing with each passing second. There was no sign of Jennifer. Her coat was gone, her hiking boots missing, but her phone and other belongings were still there. On the floor near the door, he found dirt and what looked like faint smudges of blood leading out into the yard. Ethan grabbed his rifle, the weight of it grounding him. He stepped outside, following the trail of disturbed earth. It ended abruptly a few feet into the woods, as though whatever had taken her, or whatever she had followed, had vanished into thin air. He shouted her name, the sound ringing hollow in the vast, silent forest. Hours passed as he searched, his calls growing hoarse and desperate. When night fell, he returned to the cabin, his legs trembling and his mind racing. Ethan called the local authorities, his voice shaking as he described Jennifer's disappearance. A small search party was organized, and they combed the surrounding area well into the night, but there was no trace of her. By the time the search was called off, Ethan was left alone in the cabin, staring at the claw marks on the door. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Somewhere deep in the forest, the silence grew heavier, as though it were watching him. Days turned into a blur of searching and waiting. The local authorities conducted their investigations but found nothing. No footprints, no clothing scraps, no evidence of Jennifer. The search parties dwindled as hope faded. leaving Ethan alone in his despair. The once cozy cabin now felt suffocating, each creak of the wooden floorboards amplifying his solitude. Ethan spent his days wandering the forest with his rifle, retracing the same paths, calling Jennifer's name until his voice was raw. He tried to hold on to hope, but with each fruitless search, that hope withered, replaced by a gnawing sense of guilt. He couldn't stop replaying the moment he had left for hunting, wondering what he could have done differently. The nights were worse. Sleep was elusive, and when it came, it was fractured by nightmares. Flashes of Jennifer's face twisted in terror, shadowy figures stalking her through the woods. He'd wake in a cold sweat, clutching his rifle like a lifeline. On the fifth morning, Ethan sat on the porch, staring blankly at the tree line. The forest seemed to mock him with its stillness. He was so lost in his thoughts that he almost didn't hear it. A soft knock on the cabin door. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment he thought he had imagined it. Then it came again, louder this time. He scrambled to his feet, the chair tipping over as he rushed to the door. When he opened it, his heart stopped. Jennifer stood on the porch, her clothes dirty and torn, her hair matted with leaves. Her face was pale, her eyes dull, but it was her. Alive. Ethan pulled her into his arms, his relief spilling out in gasping sobs. "Oh my God, Jen," he whispered. "Where have you been? What happened?" She didn't answer, only hugging him back weakly. Her body was cold, her movements sluggish. Ethan guided her inside, sitting her down by the fire and wrapping her in a blanket. He bombarded her with questions, where she had gone, how she had gotten back, if she was hurt. But Jennifer offered little more than murmured reassurances that she was fine. Ethan tried to push down his unease. She was safe, and that was all that mattered. Yet something about her seemed off. Her eyes, once vibrant and full of warmth, now seemed distant, almost hollow. And when she smiled at him, a fleeting, unnatural curve of her lips, it sent a shiver down his spine. That night, as Jennifer slept beside him, Ethan stayed awake, staring at the ceiling. Her return should have brought him peace, but instead it left him with a growing sense of dread. At some point in the early hours of the morning, he heard it, the faint creak of the floorboards. He turned his head just in time to see Jennifer slipping out the door and into the forest. Ethan sat up, his heart pounding. The rifle beside the bed suddenly felt like more than a precaution. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before grabbing his rifle and quietly slipping out after Jennifer. The night air was crisp, and the moon cast an eerie glow over the forest. He moved carefully, keeping his distance but ensuring he didn't lose sight of her. His heart pounded as he watched her figure disappear into the dense trees. Jennifer's movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as if she were drawn by an invisible force. She didn't falter or glance back, her pace steady despite the uneven terrain. Ethan followed, his unease growing with every step. After several minutes, Jennifer stopped in a small clearing. Ethan crouched behind a thick oak tree, watching intently. The clearing was bathed in pale moonlight, and in its center lay a crude altar of stones, dark stains marking its surface. He stifled a gasp when he saw Jennifer kneel before it. She pulled something from her jacket pocket, a small, wriggling animal. Ethan's stomach twisted as he realized it was a rabbit. Jennifer held it over the altar, her movements slow and deliberate. Then, with a motion Ethan couldn't quite see, she sacrificed the creature. Blood spilled onto the stones, glistening in the moonlight. Ethan's grip on his rifle tightened. His mind raced, torn between confronting her and trying to understand what he was seeing. This wasn't the Jennifer he knew. She had never been cruel, let alone capable of such an act. Before he could decide what to do, Jennifer began to whisper, soft, guttural words that made Ethan's skin crawl. The air in the clearing grew colder, the silence of the forest now oppressive. Ethan strained to hear, but the words were unlike anything he'd ever encountered, ancient and inhuman. As she continued, a low rustling sound came from the shadows surrounding the clearing. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat as he scanned the tree line, his eyes straining against the darkness. For a moment he thought he saw something, a tall, skeletal figure with antlers reflecting the moonlight. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Jennifer finished her ritual and stood, her hands and clothes smeared with blood. She turned, her face eerily calm, and began walking back toward the cabin, as if nothing had happened. Ethan waited until she was out of sight before approaching the altar. The stones were warm to the touch, the blood still fresh. Ethan examined them closely, noticing deep carvings that resembled runes or symbols. His mind churned with questions, but one thing was clear. Something was wrong with Jennifer, and it had everything to do with whatever force she was communing with in these woods. When he returned to the cabin, Jennifer was already in bed, her breathing slow and even. Ethan watched her from the doorway, the rifle still in his hands. He didn't sleep that night. The memory of her unsettling smile burned into his mind. Whatever had brought her back wasn't his wife, not entirely. Ethan spent the following day in a state of quiet vigilance. Jennifer seemed unchanged from her usual self, or at least the version of her that had returned. She moved around the cabin with an unsettling calm, preparing breakfast and humming softly. Ethan couldn't bring himself to eat, his thoughts preoccupied with the ritual he had witnessed the night before. "I was thinking we could take a hike today," Jennifer said, breaking the silence. Her voice was light, cheerful even, but there was something hollow beneath it. Ethan forced a smile. "Maybe later. I'm not feeling great." Jennifer shrugged and stepped outside, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. He stared at his untouched plate, the memories of the altar and the shadowy figure haunting him. There was no denying it now. Something sinister was at play in these woods, and Jennifer was at the center of it. Determined to find answers, Ethan began searching the cabin for anything that might explain what was happening. He rifled through drawers, flipped through old notebooks, and scoured every inch of the place. Finally, in the attic, he found a small, dusty box labeled with his uncle's handwriting. Inside were photographs, maps of the surrounding forest, and a worn journal. Ethan flipped through the pages, his breath catching as he read his uncle's accounts. The journal detailed strange occurrences in the woods, disappearances, sightings of a tall, antlered figure, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. His uncle had written of a creature called a Wendigo, a malevolent forest spirit that preyed on humans, corrupting their minds and bodies. Ethan's stomach churned as he read a chilling entry. "I've seen it now. The Wendigo is real. It hunts these woods, feeding on the living and twisting the dead into its servants. I fear I'm next. If I go missing, know that it wasn't by choice. Stay away from the woods. Destroy the cabin if you must, but don't let it claim you too." Ethan slammed the journal shut, his hands trembling. The Wendigo wasn't just a legend. It was real, and it had taken his uncle. Now it had Jennifer. That night, Ethan pretended to sleep, his rifle within arm's reach. Sure enough, Jennifer slipped out of bed and into the woods again. This time, Ethan didn't hesitate. He followed her at a distance, moving silently through the trees. She returned to the same clearing. The bloodied altar remained, but this time the Wendigo was there, its towering form looming over her. It was taller than Ethan had imagined, its skeletal frame covered in pale, leathery skin. A deer skull with jagged antlers served as its head, empty sockets glowing faintly. Its clawed hands twitched as Jennifer knelt before it, offering another sacrifice. Ethan's breath caught as the creature leaned down, its skull mere inches from Jennifer's face. For a moment he thought it might devour her, but instead it placed a clawed hand on her head. A low growl rumbled through the clearing, a sound that seemed to shake the very ground. Ethan raised his rifle, his hands steady despite the terror coursing through him. He couldn't let this continue, not to Jennifer, not to anyone. Ethan steadied his breathing, finger hovering over the trigger. His heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming for him to run, but he couldn't leave Jennifer, or whatever remained of her, alone with the monstrosity in the clearing. The Wendigo turned its antlered head suddenly, as though sensing his presence. Ethan froze. Its glowing sockets scanned the tree line, lingering dangerously close to where he crouched. For a brief moment, he thought it had spotted him. But then its gaze shifted, and it let out a guttural, inhuman growl. Ethan held his position, watching as Jennifer rose from her kneeling position. She turned to face the Wendigo, her lips moving in a soft murmur that Ethan couldn't hear. To his horror, the creature responded, not in words, but with a series of guttural clicks and growls that seemed to resonate deep within Ethan's chest. He tried to steady his nerves, but then he heard something that chilled him to his core. A voice, Not the Wendigo's growl, not Jennifer's whisper, but a voice he hadn't heard in years. "Ethan." The voice was raspy, faint but unmistakable. It was his uncle. Ethan's grip on the rifle tightened, his pulse roaring in his ears. He scanned the clearing again, his eyes darting between Jennifer and the towering figure of the Wendigo. Then slowly the creature shifted, stepping aside as if to reveal something, or someone. His uncle emerged from the shadows, or at least what was left of him. The man who had raised Ethan now stood before him, his frame gaunt, his eyes sunken and glowing faintly with the same eerie light as the Wendigo's sockets. His clothes hung from his skeletal frame in tatters, and his movements were jerky, almost puppet-like. "Ethan," his uncle repeated, his voice laced with something Ethan couldn't quite place. Pleading, regret, hunger. Ethan's mind raced, struggling to process what he was seeing. His uncle stepped closer, stopping near Jennifer. She stared ahead blankly, as though in a trance, her lips curling into that unsettling, too-wide smile. "I tried to fight it," his uncle said, his voice hollow. "I tried to warn you." The journal's words flashed in Ethan's mind. "It feeds on the living and twists the dead into its servants." His uncle wasn't alive, not really. Whatever stood before him was a puppet of the Wendigo, a grim reminder of what awaited those who succumbed to the creature's influence. "Join us," his uncle said, his voice soft but insistent. "It's easier that way." Ethan's body tensed, anger and despair warring within him. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "This ends here." He stepped out from behind the tree, rifle raised. The Wendigo turned toward him, its antlers scraping against the low branches as it tilted its skull in what almost seemed like amusement. Jennifer and his uncle turned as well, their faces void of any humanity Ethan once knew. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, aiming at the Wendigo. His finger tightened on the trigger. The woods exploded with sound as the first shot rang out. The rifle's crack shattered the oppressive silence of the forest. The bullet struck the Wendigo square in the chest, but instead of falling, it staggered back only slightly, emitting a guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the trees. Its glowing eyes fixed on Ethan, burning with an unnatural fury. Jennifer screamed, her voice raw and piercing. "No, Ethan, stop!" She moved toward him, but Ethan shifted his aim, pointing the rifle at her. "Stay back!" he barked, his voice trembling but firm. She froze, her wide, unsettling grin faltering into something more human. Fear, confusion, or perhaps something darker. The Wendigo lunged forward, faster than Ethan expected. Its skeletal limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally as it closed the distance, claws slashing at the air. Ethan fired again, this time aiming for its head. The bullet struck the deer's skull, splintering bone and sending the creature reeling. But it didn't go down. It roared, the sound primal and earth-shaking, and Ethan realized this was no ordinary beast. It wasn't just flesh and bone. It was something ancient, something beyond his understanding. He dropped his rifle and drew his revolver, the cold steel reassuring in his hand. The Wendigo circled him now, its antlers scraping against the low-hanging branches. Jennifer stood motionless at the edge of the clearing, her expression a mask of horror and fascination. His uncle's reanimated form lurched toward him, reaching out with skeletal hands. "Ethan," his uncle rasped, "you can't kill it. You can only join it." "I'd rather die," Ethan spat, raising the revolver. He fired twice, the first bullet shattering his uncle's skull, and the second piercing his chest. The undead figure crumpled to the ground, lifeless once more. The Wendigo let out a deafening screech, its movements becoming more erratic. It lashed out, claws tearing through a nearby tree trunk as though it were paper. Ethan backed away, his revolver trained on the creature. Jennifer took a step forward. "Ethan, don't hurt it. You don't understand." Her voice was desperate, almost pleading. Ethan's resolve hardened. "That thing isn't your savior, Jen. It's a monster." The Wendigo lunged again, its claws swiping inches from Ethan's face. He fired the remaining bullets into its torso, each shot ripping through its pale, leathery flesh. The creature staggered, dark ichor oozing from the wounds, but it didn't fall. Desperation clawed at Ethan's mind. He grabbed a fallen branch, thrusting it into the creature's chest like a makeshift spear. The Wendigo shrieked, its skeletal frame convulsing. It staggered back, thrashing wildly, before collapsing onto the altar. For a moment, the forest was silent. Ethan stood over the creature, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Jennifer dropped to her knees, clutching her head as though in pain. The Wendigo's glowing eyes flickered, its form twitching and curling in on itself. With a final guttural growl, it fell still, its twisted body crumbling into ash. Ethan turned to Jennifer, hoping the nightmare was over, but as her tear-streaked face looked up at him, he saw the haunted look in her eyes. Jennifer collapsed onto the forest floor, trembling as though an invisible weight had been lifted from her. Ethan rushed to her side, his revolver still clutched tightly in one hand, his other gently gripping her shoulder. "Jennifer," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "Jennifer, look at me." She blinked, her eyes regaining some clarity. Tears welled up as she focused on him, her expression shifting from confusion to anguish. "Ethan, what happened?" Her voice was hoarse, and she sounded more like herself than she had in days. "You're back," Ethan said, his voice shaking with a mix of relief and exhaustion. "It's over. I think, whatever it was, it's gone." Jennifer's face crumpled, and she began to sob. "I couldn't control it. I tried to fight it, but it was inside my head. It made me do things. Horrible things." Ethan held her tightly, his own eyes stinging with unshed tears. "It wasn't you, Jen. That thing, it was controlling you." Jennifer pulled back slightly, her hands clutching Ethan's shirt as she looked at him with desperation. "I saw him, Ethan. Your uncle, he wasn't himself anymore. That thing, it changes people." "I know," Ethan said grimly, glancing toward the altar where the Wendigo's ashes still smoldered. His uncle's body lay a few feet away, twisted and lifeless. Ethan averted his eyes, the weight of what he had done pressing heavily on his chest. Jennifer's sobs quieted as she wiped her face with trembling hands. "We need to leave," she said, her voice urgent. "Now, before it comes back." Ethan nodded. The thought had already crossed his mind. Whatever he had killed or thought he had killed felt too ancient, too powerful to be entirely destroyed. The woods still felt wrong, as though the Wendigo's presence lingered like a shadow over the trees. He helped Jennifer to her feet, supporting her as they made their way back toward the cabin. The forest seemed darker than before, the air heavy with an unnatural chill. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch sent a spike of adrenaline through Ethan's body. His grip on the revolver remained firm. When they reached the cabin, Ethan wasted no time gathering their things. Jennifer sat silently at the kitchen table, staring at her hands as though they belonged to someone else. He packed quickly, shoving clothes and supplies into bags with hurried movements. Finally, they loaded their belongings into the SUV. Jennifer hesitated on the porch, glancing back at the cabin one last time. "This place," she whispered. "It's cursed. We should have never come here." Ethan didn't respond. He started the car, his eyes scanning the tree line as the headlights pierced the darkness. Jennifer climbed into the passenger seat, her hands gripping her knees. The SUV rumbled to life, and they drove down the dirt road in silence. Ethan kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting the glowing eyes of the Wendigo to appear. For now, though, the road remained empty. The dirt road stretched endlessly before them, the cabin disappearing into the darkness behind. Ethan gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. Jennifer sat beside him, her face pale and drawn, staring blankly out the window. The forest seemed alive around them, the trees twisting unnaturally in the headlights' glow. Shadows danced in the corners of Ethan's vision, but each time he looked directly, there was nothing there. He tried to focus on driving, to push the creeping unease aside, but it clung to him like a second skin. Jennifer broke the silence. "Do you think it's really gone?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm not taking any chances. We're getting as far from here as we can." Jennifer nodded, though her expression remained troubled. She opened her mouth to say something else, but then her gaze snapped to the rearview mirror. Her eyes widened in terror. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling, "behind us." Ethan's stomach dropped as he glanced into the mirror. At first he saw only the darkness of the forest road. Then, just at the edge of the light cast by the taillights, a shape emerged. It was tall and skeletal, its antlers casting jagged shadows on the trees. Its glowing eyes burned like twin embers, locked onto the vehicle as it followed. "It can't be," Ethan muttered, his grip tightening on the wheel. He pressed down on the accelerator, the SUV lurching forward. The tires kicked up dirt and gravel as the vehicle sped along the narrow road. The Wendigo didn't falter. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its long limbs stretching as it pursued them. The distance between it and the car seemed to shrink with each passing second, despite Ethan's efforts to outrun it. Jennifer clutched his arm. "Ethan, it's getting closer." "I see it," he snapped, his voice tense. His mind raced, searching for a plan, but there was nothing he could do except drive. The road curved sharply ahead, and Ethan swerved to stay on course. The Wendigo remained in pursuit, unrelenting. As they rounded the bend, the creature suddenly veered off the road, disappearing into the trees. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest as he scanned the mirror, expecting it to reappear. But the road behind them remained empty. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The forest began to thin, the trees giving way to open fields. The distant lights of a small town appeared on the horizon, their warm glow like a beacon of safety. Ethan exhaled shakily. "I think we're okay," he said, though the words felt hollow. He didn't believe them, not entirely. Jennifer didn't respond. She stared straight ahead, her hands trembling in her lap. As they entered the outskirts of the town, Ethan glanced one last time in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment he saw it again, the Wendigo's shadowy form standing at the edge of the woods. Its glowing eyes burned into his, a silent promise that their encounter was far from over. Ethan's jaw tightened, and he forced his gaze back to the road. The town lights grew brighter, but the feeling of being watched never left him. They had escaped the forest, but Ethan knew the Wendigo wasn't bound by trees or trails. It was patient, it was hungry, and it would wait. The Appalachian Mountains stretched endlessly before Mason, their rugged beauty an irresistible call. An experienced hunter, Mason had spent years pursuing big game across North America, but something about these mountains felt different. He'd heard the locals talk of the Appalachian wilderness as wild, in a way that transcended the physical landscape, a place where folklore seeped into reality. He scoffed at their warnings. Mason pulled into the ranger station nestled at the edge of the forest. Inside, a grizzled ranger with a name tag reading Wes greeted him with a wary smile. "Permits are in order," Wes said, handing Mason a map. "But before you head out, you need to know a few things." Mason leaned against the counter, only half listening as the ranger began speaking. "Follow these rules," Wes said, sliding a folded piece of paper across the counter. "They'll keep you safe out there." Mason unfolded the paper and read the rules aloud, his tone skeptical. "Always leave an offering of food at dawn and dusk. If you hear singing, hum along until it stops. Never walk through a circle of stones, even if it's in your path. Avoid your reflection in any body of water after sunset. If you feel something breathing on your neck, don't look back." Mason raised an eyebrow. "You serious?" "As a heart attack," Wes replied. "These mountains don't play by the same rules you're used to. Break one of these, and you might not come back." Mason chuckled, folding the paper and tucking it into his jacket pocket. "I've hunted grizzlies in Alaska and mountain lions in Montana. I think I'll be fine." Wes didn't laugh. "Suit yourself, but don't say I didn't warn you." Mason left the station, his truck rattling along the gravel road that led to the forest's edge. He parked, shouldered his pack, and slung his rifle over his back. His revolver, a trusty .44 Magnum, sat snug in its holster at his hip. The forest greeted him with its own peculiar stillness. Tall oaks and pines loomed overhead, their canopies knitting together to form a dense patchwork of shadow and light. He inhaled deeply, savoring the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves. "Rules," he muttered, shaking his head. "Superstitious nonsense." By late afternoon, he had set up a small camp in a clearing. The sun dipped low, casting golden light through the trees. As the shadows lengthened, Mason felt the forest change. The air grew heavier, and the chirping of birds and rustling of small animals faded into an eerie silence. He dismissed the unease that prickled at the back of his neck. After all, he was armed and experienced. What could possibly go wrong? The fire crackled and popped as Mason sat back on his camp chair, staring into the flames. The ranger's strange rules gnawed at him, though he refused to admit it. He pulled the folded paper from his pocket and read them again, the firelight flickering over the odd list. Rules for surviving the deep Appalachian wilderness. 1. Always leave an offering of food at dawn and dusk. 2. If you hear singing, hum along until it stops. 3. Never walk through a circle of stones, even if it's in your path. 4. Avoid your reflection in any body of water after sunset. 5. If you feel something breathing on your neck, don't look back. Mason scoffed, crumpling the paper and tossing it onto his pack. Offering food to the woods, humming along with singing? What a load of crap. He finished his meal, ignoring the sudden cold edge in the air. The woods were quiet now, too quiet. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves, no distant hoots of an owl. Just silence, heavy and oppressive. Mason's instincts told him something was off, but he chalked it up to his overactive imagination. He grabbed a tin of beans and a strip of jerky and chucked them a few feet from his campfire with a smirk. There's your offering, forest spirits. Happy now? Satisfied with his mockery, he crawled into his tent and zipped it shut. His rifle leaned against the side, loaded and within reach, and the revolver rested beneath his makeshift pillow. Mason wasn't afraid of folklore, but he wasn't stupid either. If something real came prowling in the night, he'd be ready. He drifted off, the fire casting shadows that danced eerily against the walls of his tent. Hours passed in restless sleep until a faint sound stirred him. Singing. Mason's eyes shot open. The melody was soft, lilting, and just beyond the edge of his hearing. He sat up, straining to listen. It sounded like a woman's voice, sweet and haunting, carrying through the still night air. He grabbed his rifle, his heart pounding as he unzipped the tent and stepped into the cold darkness. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly. The singing continued, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. It wasn't any tune he recognized, just a series of melodic, mournful notes that sent a shiver up his spine. "Hello," he called, his voice rough. "Is someone there?" The singing stopped abruptly, leaving an even heavier silence in its wake. Mason stood frozen, his grip on the rifle tightening. "Probably just the wind," he muttered, though he couldn't convince himself. He turned back toward his tent, and that's when he felt it. A breath, warm and damp, brushing against the back of his neck. His body went rigid, the hairs on his arms standing on end. "Don't look back." The ranger's words flashed through his mind, but Mason wasn't one to follow superstitions. Spinning around, he raised his rifle, ready to confront whatever was there. Nothing, just darkness and trees. Yet the feeling lingered, that undeniable sense of being watched. Mason stood frozen in place, the rifle steady in his grip, eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The darkness beyond the dying embers of his campfire felt alive, shifting with unseen menace. His heart pounded, and despite his experience, an unfamiliar fear crept into his chest. He waited, straining to hear even the faintest sound. Nothing. The silence was unnatural, pressing against his ears like cotton, amplifying his own heartbeat. Mason lowered the rifle slightly, forcing himself to breathe deeply. "Pull yourself together," he muttered under his breath. Still uneasy, he fed a few logs into the fire, coaxing the flames back to life. The crackling light pushed back the oppressive darkness, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. He glanced at his watch. 3:17 a.m., still hours until dawn. Mason decided to take a look around the camp's perimeter, if only to calm his nerves. The firelight flickered over the trees as he stepped into the shadows, his rifle ready. He moved slowly, his boots crunching on the dry leaves and twigs scattered across the forest floor. A few yards from the camp, he found something odd. A circle of stones, perfectly arranged, with a strange symbol carved into the soil at its center. The symbol looked like an elongated spiral, with jagged lines radiating from its edges. Mason frowned. Kids messing around or some wannabe occult nonsense? The ranger's warning surfaced in his mind. Never walk through a circle of stones. He chuckled nervously. Guess I'm breaking another rule. Stepping forward, he crossed through the circle, his boots crushing the carefully arranged stones. As he did, a sharp gust of wind tore through the clearing, extinguishing his campfire. The sudden darkness was absolute, swallowing even the faint glow of the stars above. Mason cursed, fumbling with his flashlight. When he finally managed to switch it on, the beam revealed something that hadn't been there before. Claw marks. 4 deep parallel gashes etched into the trunk of a nearby tree, as though something massive and powerful had raked it in fury. The bark was still wet, the sap glistening under the flashlight's beam. A low, guttural growl came from somewhere behind him. Mason spun, the flashlight shaking slightly in his grip. The beam caught a pair of glowing yellow eyes just for an instant before they disappeared into the shadows. Adrenaline surged through him. "Who's there?" he barked, raising the rifle. The growl came again, closer this time, reverberating through the still air. Mason took a step back, his finger tightening on the trigger. A shape emerged from the darkness, massive and hunched, its fur matted and black as tar. Its elongated snout revealed gleaming teeth, and its eyes glowed with a malevolent intelligence. The creature let out a deafening roar and lunged. Mason fired, the gunshot echoing through the forest like a thunderclap. The rifle's crack shattered the oppressive silence, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the monstrous form hurtling toward Mason. The creature staggered as the bullet struck its shoulder, letting out a bone-chilling howl that reverberated through the forest. Mason took aim again, his instincts kicking in. Another shot rang out, this one hitting the beast square in the chest. It collapsed into the underbrush with a heavy thud, its glowing eyes dimming. For a moment, Mason stood there, panting, his rifle still raised. He approached the crumpled body cautiously, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his hand. The creature was unlike anything he'd ever seen. It resembled a wolf, but its proportions were grotesque, its limbs unnaturally long, its claws curved like sickles, and its teeth far too large for its maw. Its fur was matted and coarse, and its eyes still glowed faintly even in death. "What the hell are you?" Mason whispered, his voice barely audible. He prodded the creature with the barrel of his rifle, but it didn't move. The hunter's pulse began to slow, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Was this some sort of mutated animal? A trick of the light and adrenaline? He wasn't sure, but he knew one thing. He couldn't stay here. Whatever this thing was, there could be more of them. Grabbing a tarp from his pack, Mason hastily wrapped the creature's body and dragged it closer to camp. He wanted to examine it more thoroughly once the sun rose, but as he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest was too quiet, the air too still, and then the faint sound of movement, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, came from the direction he'd just left. Mason froze, his hand on the tarp. His flashlight scanned the woods, but the beam revealed nothing. Slowly, he turned back to the creature's body. It was gone. The tarp lay empty, the folds undisturbed, as if the massive corpse had simply vanished. Mason's blood ran cold. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. Did he miss something? Had he imagined it all? A low growl rumbled behind him. Mason spun around, his rifle ready, and his flashlight beam landed on the same creature he had just killed, or at least something that looked eerily like it. Except now it was larger. Its shoulders bulged with muscle, and its eyes glowed brighter, burning like twin flames in the dark. The wounds from his bullets were gone, replaced by smooth, unscarred flesh. "What the hell?" Mason muttered, backing away as the creature advanced. It roared again, the sound deafening and charged. Mason fired twice more, hitting it in the chest and head, but it barely flinched. Realizing he couldn't kill it, not permanently at least, Mason turned and ran. His feet pounded the forest floor, his breaths ragged as he pushed deeper into the trees. Behind him, the creature's guttural snarls grew louder, closer. Mason's legs burned as he sprinted through the dark forest, his flashlight beam jerking wildly. He could hear the creature gaining on him, its snarls reverberating through the trees. Every step felt heavier, the oppressive air of the forest thickening with an almost malevolent presence. He ducked under low-hanging branches and leapt over a fallen log, refusing to look back. The memory of the creature, its glowing eyes, its grotesque muscled form, drove him forward. He'd killed it once, twice actually, yet here it was, stronger than before. "What the hell is going on?" Mason growled under his breath, glancing at his rifle. It had always been reliable. but against this thing it might as well have been a toy. Finally, he spotted a rocky outcrop ahead. It rose sharply above the forest floor, offering a narrow crevice where he could take shelter. Mason scrambled up the jagged rocks, his boots slipping on the damp surface, until he wedged himself into the gap. He crouched there, his rifle pointed at the path he'd just come from, every nerve in his body screaming for rest. He steadied his breathing, trying to quiet the thundering of his heart as he waited. The forest below was still. The creature's snarls had ceased, replaced by an unnerving silence. Then he saw it. The creature stepped into view, moving with an unnatural grace for something its size. Its glowing eyes scanned the forest, and its massive claws scraped against a nearby tree, leaving deep gashes in the bark. The thing sniffed the air, its elongated snout turning toward the outcrop. Mason held his breath. His fingers tightened on the rifle's trigger, ready to fire if it came closer. The creature prowled around the base of the outcrop, growling low in its throat. Its claws dug into the dirt, and for a moment Mason thought it might start climbing. But then it stopped, lifting its head to release a long, mournful howl that echoed through the forest. Mason winced, the sound making his chest tighten. He realized it wasn't just calling to itself, it was calling to others. "Damn it," Mason whispered, his voice barely audible. As the howl faded, the creature turned and disappeared into the trees, its massive form vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Mason stayed frozen in place, his rifle still aimed at the spot where it had stood. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. Slowly he lowered his weapon, his muscles aching from the tension. The forest was silent again, but the silence felt different this time. It wasn't the absence of sound, but a waiting, an anticipation that set his teeth on edge. Mason knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. His mind raced as he climbed down from the outcrop, scanning the area for any signs of the creature's return. He needed answers. He couldn't face that thing again without understanding what he was up against. That was when he stumbled across the backpack. It lay half buried in the underbrush, torn and weathered, as if it had been abandoned for years. Mason knelt beside it, his flashlight illuminating a name scrawled on the faded fabric: Dr. T. Willis. He opened it, finding a notebook inside. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, diagrams, and symbols, evidence of a folklore researcher's desperate search for the truth. Mason flipped through the notebook, the pages damp and frayed but still legible. The researcher's handwriting was hurried, almost frantic, as if they'd been scribbling notes while running for their life. Symbols and sketches filled the margins, circles, spirals, and jagged patterns that felt unsettling to look at. One page caught Mason's attention immediately. At the top, written in bold letters, were the words, "The Curse of the Appalachian Forest, the Bell Witch's Domain." Mason frowned. The Bell Witch? He'd heard stories, the kind of tall tales passed around campfires, but he'd always dismissed them as folklore. He read on, his flashlight beam steady on the page. The Bell Witch's curse extends beyond her Tennessee origins. Local legends suggest she laid claim to these Appalachian woods long ago, binding the land and its creatures to her will. The rules locals provide are not superstition. They are survival tactics. Break them, and you invite her wrath. The words hit Mason like a punch to the gut. He thought back to the ranger's list, his own flippant disregard for the strange rules, the offering he hadn't properly made, the stone circle he'd carelessly stepped through. Another page described the creature he had encountered. Reports of a monstrous wolf-like entity persist in these woods. Known as the Curse-Bearer, it is said to hunt those who defy the witch's laws. Each time it is killed, it returns stronger, fueled by the violator's transgressions. The only way to weaken it is to follow the rules, undoing the damage caused by breaking them. Mason's chest tightened as he pieced it together. The growling, the claw marks, the impossible resurrection of the creature. He was dealing with the Curse-Bearer, and worse, it was after him. The next pages detailed the rules again, accompanied by chilling annotations. 1. Always leave an offering of food at dawn and dusk. Appeasement for the spirits bound to her curse. Without it, they grow hostile. 2. If you hear singing, hum along until it stops. The witch uses this to lure her victims. Mimicking it shows respect and diffuses her anger. 3. Never walk through a circle of stones, even if it's in your path. These are her sigils, markers of her domain. Crossing them is an act of defiance. 4. Avoid your reflection in any body of water after sunset. The reflection may not be yours. Staring too long gives her access to your mind. 5. If you feel something breathing on your neck, don't look back. It's her testing your resolve. Turning around acknowledges her presence and seals your fate. Mason swallowed hard, his mind racing. He'd broken 2 of these rules. He hadn't made a proper offering, and he'd crossed the circle of stones. His defiance had marked him. The last note was scrawled messily at the bottom of the page, as if written in haste. Follow the rules exactly to reverse the curse. If the curse-bearer is defeated while the rules are followed, it will not return. Mason shut the notebook and stuffed it into his pack. He didn't have a choice. If he wanted to survive, he had to play by the witch's rules. The forest around him seemed to pulse, as though it had sensed his decision. Mason shouldered his rifle and revolver, his jaw set. The hunt was far from over. Mason sat with his back against a tree, clutching the notebook like it was a lifeline. The forest around him felt different now, more alive, more aware. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves made his pulse race. He couldn't shake the feeling that the curse-bearer was watching, waiting for him to slip up again. He opened the notebook once more, rereading the rules. If this curse was real, and all evidence pointed to that terrifying truth, then his survival depended on following them. He glanced at his watch. The first light of dawn was just beginning to creep through the trees. The first rule echoed in his mind: always leave an offering of food at dawn and dusk. Reaching into his pack, Mason pulled out a can of beans and a protein bar. He placed them carefully on a flat rock nearby, feeling ridiculous as he arranged them with what he hoped was enough respect. "Here's your offering," he muttered under his breath. "Take it or leave it." The forest seemed to exhale. The oppressive weight that had been pressing against him lifted slightly, and the stillness felt less hostile. Mason let out a shaky breath, realizing how tense he'd been. The next step was harder. He needed to return to the stone circle he'd disrupted and try to make amends. The thought sent a chill through him. If the curse-bearer was still stalking him, retracing his steps would feel like walking straight into a trap. Still, he had no choice. Slinging his rifle over his shoulder, Mason began the trek back toward the cursed circle. Every step felt like an eternity, his ears straining for the telltale growl or the snap of a twig that would signal the creature's return. He found the circle exactly as he'd left it. The stones were scattered, their careful arrangement destroyed by his careless boots. Mason hesitated at the edge, the memory of the ranger's warning echoing in his mind. Never walk through a circle of stones. "I already screwed this up," he muttered. "Might as well fix it." Using the notes from the researcher's journal as a guide, Mason carefully reset the stones, placing them back into a perfect circle. The jagged spiral in the center still glared up at him, a symbol he didn't understand but instinctively feared. When the circle was complete, he stepped back and whispered, "I'm sorry," feeling absurd but knowing he had to mean it. As if in response, the wind picked up, swirling through the trees with a low, eerie hum. Mason's instinct screamed at him to run, but he stood his ground. The wind died down as suddenly as it had started, leaving the circle undisturbed. Mason turned and began the trek back to his camp. He had to prepare for the next encounter with the curse-bearer. The rules had bought him a reprieve, but the hunt wasn't over. As the sun climbed higher, he felt a faint, unsettling certainty. The creature would come for him again, but this time he wouldn't be caught off guard. Mason's camp felt like a fragile refuge, a temporary bubble of safety in the vast, cursed forest. He checked his rifle and revolver for the 3rd time, ensuring they were loaded and ready. His hands moved methodically, the motions calming him as the forest around him seemed to hold its breath. The sun hung low in the sky, its golden light casting long shadows through the trees. Dusk was approaching, and with it the first critical test of whether following the rules would weaken the creature. Mason prepared his second offering, arranging a strip of jerky and a tin of peaches on the same flat rock he'd used that morning. He placed them down carefully, whispering, "For the forest," as the journal had suggested. The air shifted slightly, almost as if the forest acknowledged his efforts. But as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, Mason's gut told him he wouldn't get through the night unchallenged. The first sign came just as the stars began to appear. A low growl echoed through the woods, faint but unmistakable. Mason's grip tightened on his rifle as he scanned the trees, his breath slow and steady. "Come on," he muttered, bracing himself. The curse-bearer emerged from the shadows, its glowing eyes cutting through the darkness like twin lanterns. Mason's stomach twisted at the sight. It was still monstrous, but there was something different this time. It moved slower, its steps less sure, and its hulking body seemed slightly smaller. The rules were working. The creature snarled, its jagged teeth gleaming in the moonlight. It lunged, and Mason fired. The rifle's crack shattered the silence, and the bullet struck true, slamming into the creature's chest. It stumbled but didn't fall. Mason fired again, aiming for the head. This time the creature let out a pained howl and collapsed into the underbrush. He didn't hesitate. Mason slung his rifle over his shoulder and pulled his revolver, circling cautiously toward the downed beast. Its body twitched, but it didn't rise. The glowing eyes were dimmer now, their light flickering like a dying flame. "Not so invincible now, are you?" Mason muttered, though his relief was tempered by the knowledge that the curse-bearer wasn't done yet. He retreated back to camp, his revolver still in hand, and waited. The minutes stretched into hours, the night dragging on endlessly. Mason's nerves were raw, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves setting his heart racing. But the creature didn't return, not yet. By the time the first light of dawn appeared, Mason dared to hope that he'd bought himself more time. He placed his morning offering on the flat rock, this time adding an extra strip of jerky for good measure. The forest felt less hostile, the air lighter. Mason couldn't shake the sense that he was being tested, that the rules weren't just a means of survival. They were a way of proving himself to the forest's unseen forces. He wasn't out of the woods yet, literally or figuratively, but for the first time, Mason felt like he might have a fighting chance. Mason crouched at the edge of his camp, his eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The notebook sat open beside him, its pages detailing the final steps he needed to take. The curse-bearer was weaker now, but the journal warned that it wouldn't give up easily. He had to follow the rules to the letter and be prepared to face it one last time. The morning offering had gone untouched, yet the forest had remained silent, almost expectant. Mason's instincts told him the final confrontation was near. He gathered his supplies, double-checking his weapons and ensuring his gear was secure. The rules had been clear about what he needed to do: find water without reflecting himself in it, place an offering, and wait. It sounded simple, but Mason knew better by now. Nothing about this forest was simple. He moved cautiously through the trees, his steps deliberate and quiet. The journal mentioned a stream nearby, and it didn't take long for him to find it. The water flowed clear and cold, its surface rippling gently in the breeze. Mason knelt at the edge, careful to avoid his reflection as he filled a small cup with water. He set it beside a strip of dried meat, then stepped back, keeping his eyes on the offering. The forest seemed to react immediately. The wind picked up, swirling around him in an eerie dance. Shadows deepened, and a faint guttural growl echoed from the trees. "It's time," Mason muttered, gripping his rifle tightly. The curse-bearer emerged from the shadows, its form even more grotesque than before. While it was smaller than during their first encounter, its presence was no less terrifying. Its eyes glowed with a desperate rage, its claws gouging the earth as it advanced. Mason didn't wait for it to charge. He raised his rifle and fired, the shot striking the creature in the shoulder. It howled in pain but didn't falter. Mason fired again, aiming for its chest, and the curse-bearer stumbled. The creature lunged, closing the distance with shocking speed. Mason dropped his rifle and drew his revolver, firing point-blank into its snarling face. The shot sent it reeling, but its claws swiped at him, tearing through his jacket and grazing his arm. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Mason rolled to the side and fired again, hitting the beast in the neck. It collapsed with a thud, its glowing eyes dimming. Mason stood over the creature, his chest heaving. This time he didn't wait for it to regenerate. He aimed at its head and pulled the trigger, emptying the rest of his revolver into its skull. The curse-bearer let out one final, agonized roar before its body convulsed and went still. Its eyes, once blazing with unnatural light, faded completely. The forest grew quiet, but it wasn't the oppressive silence Mason had grown used to. This silence felt peaceful. He stepped back, his weapon still raised, but the creature didn't move. For the first time, Mason felt certain it wouldn't come back. He had followed the rules, weakened the curse, and defeated the curse-bearer. But he wasn't staying to see if the forest had any more tests in store. The forest seemed to exhale, a long-held tension releasing into the cool morning air. Mason stood over the lifeless body of the curse-bearer, his chest heaving, his limbs trembling with exhaustion. The creature wasn't regenerating. This time it was over. He glanced at the offering he had left by the stream. The water and dried meat were untouched, but Mason felt certain they had served their purpose. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, holstered his revolver, and began the long trek back to the trailhead. The journey out of the woods felt surreal. The forest, so alive with malevolence the day before, now seemed ordinary. Birds chirped, the wind rustled the leaves, and the sun's rays dappled the ground with golden light. Yet Mason couldn't fully relax. He knew better than to trust appearances in these cursed woods. As he walked, his thoughts returned to the notebook. The rules weren't just superstition. They were a lifeline, a guide to navigating a land where reality bent to ancient curses. Mason had dismissed them at first, arrogant in his experience, and it had nearly cost him his life. The curse-bearer had been relentless, a nightmare born of his own defiance. He knew he'd been lucky to survive. Reaching the trailhead felt like crossing a finish line. His truck was still parked where he had left it, a reassuring sight in a world that had seemed completely alien just hours before. Mason loaded his gear into the back and sat behind the wheel, letting out a long breath as he stared at the dense forest he was leaving behind. He reached into his pack and pulled out the researcher's notebook. The scrawled notes, diagrams, and rules stared back at him, a testament to the desperation of someone who hadn't made it out. Mason's chest tightened as he thought about the ranger's warnings, the broken rules, and the unrelenting creature that had stalked him through the night. Wes was right, Mason muttered, shaking his head. I should have listened. He didn't plan to keep the notebook. Something about it felt wrong, like it belonged to the forest and no one else. Mason placed it on the passenger seat, intending to leave it at the ranger station. Maybe Wes would know what to do with it, or maybe he'd pass it on to the next hunter foolish enough to underestimate the Appalachian wilds. As he drove down the winding mountain road, Mason replayed the events in his mind. The rules hadn't just saved him. They had taught him a hard truth. Some places weren't meant to be conquered. In the Appalachians, the land demanded respect. Breaking its laws came with a price, one he'd barely managed to pay. When the ranger station came into view, Mason pulled in, parked, and stepped inside. Wesley looked up from his desk, his gray eyes narrowing as he took in Mason's haggard appearance. Back so soon? The ranger asked, his tone wary. Mason placed the notebook on the counter. I owe you an apology, he said, and maybe this will keep someone else alive. Wesley nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Not many make it out after breaking the rules. Mason turned to leave but paused at the door. You were right about everything. The ranger smirked faintly. I usually am. Without another word, Mason walked out, climbed into his truck, and drove away. The forest faded in his rearview mirror, but its lesson stayed with him. He would never forget the rules or the price of breaking them. Yellowstone National Park stretched endlessly before Alex and Emily, its rugged beauty unmatched. Alex adjusted the strap of his rifle slung across his back, glancing at Emily, who was squinting at the map. Should be another mile to the lake, she said with a confident nod, tucking a strand of blonde hair under her baseball cap. She carried a small backpack, more interested in taking photos than survival gear, leaving Alex to bring the essentials and the firepower. They'd left the ranger station earlier that morning, brushing off the park ranger's ominous words. A lot of folks going missing out here lately, the man had said, his weathered face serious. We've even had Bigfoot sightings in the area. Alex had laughed outright, earning a glare from Emily. Bigfoot? Really? The ranger didn't smile. Say what you want, but you'll see the signs if you're not careful. Stick to the marked trails. We'll be fine, Alex had replied, his voice brimming with bravado. Emily thanked the ranger politely. though she couldn't resist a scoff once they were out of earshot. "Bigfoot, huh?" she teased as they hiked. "Maybe we'll get a selfie with him." "Only if he poses nice," Alex said, patting his rifle. "Otherwise, he's just another trophy." Now, hours into the trail, the humor had worn off. The pristine wilderness felt quieter than it should, with only the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds breaking the silence. Alex noticed the lack of small animals. No squirrels darting across the path, no deer grazing in the distance. "You notice how quiet it is?" he asked, scanning the dense forest around them. Emily shrugged. "Just peaceful. Isn't that why we're here?" Alex didn't answer, his instincts tingling. He wasn't superstitious, but years of hunting had taught him to trust the unease creeping up his spine. His boots crunched over dried leaves as they rounded a bend, where a large footprint caught his eye. "Hold up," he said, kneeling to inspect it. The print was massive, nearly twice the size of his own boot, with deep impressions suggesting something incredibly heavy. "Bear?" Emily guessed, leaning in. "Maybe," Alex muttered, but the toes were oddly human-like, and the spacing was wrong for a bear. He didn't want to spook her, so he stood and shrugged it off. Probably just a weird print. As they continued, Alex kept his senses sharp. A low growl carried faintly on the wind, making him pause. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Emily frowned. "No, you're just trying to scare me." Alex shook his head, his grip tightening on his rifle. He scanned the tree line but saw nothing. The growl didn't come again, and Emily urged him forward, dismissing his concerns. But as they walked, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching them. The trail narrowed as Alex and Emily pressed deeper into the forest. Shadows from towering pines stretched across the path, and the late afternoon sun began its descent. Emily pulled out her phone to snap a few pictures of the landscape, but Alex's focus remained sharp. He couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched. "We should make camp soon," Alex suggested, scanning the area for a flat spot. "It'll get dark fast out here." Emily nodded, but stopped suddenly, pointing to the ground. "Look at that!" Alex followed her gaze. Another footprint, massive, deep, and unmistakably fresh. This one wasn't alone. A series of similar prints trailed off into the forest. His hunting instincts kicked in, and he knelt to examine them closer. "These are too big for any bear," he muttered. "And they're not clawed. It's weird." "Could it be a prank?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with unease. "Not likely. Too remote for that." He stood, his jaw tightening. "Let's just stay alert." As they continued, other unsettling signs emerged. Branches snapped unnaturally high off the ground, as if something tall and powerful had passed through. Large swaths of bark had been stripped from trees, leaving claw-like marks. Emily started taking fewer pictures, her earlier excitement dimming. A strange sound made them both freeze, a distant cracking of wood, like a tree being snapped in half. Alex's hand instinctively went to the rifle slung across his shoulder. "What was that?" Emily whispered. "Could be a falling tree," Alex said, though he didn't believe his own words. The sound was deliberate, as if something had broken the wood with force. The tension between them was palpable as they found a small clearing to set up camp. Alex busied himself with building a fire while Emily unpacked their gear. Despite his calm demeanor, he couldn't shake the sense that they were being stalked. As night fell, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. The usual sounds of nocturnal wildlife, crickets, owls, rustling leaves, were absent. Emily sat close to the fire, her back to Alex, as he cooked a small meal of canned stew over the flames. "Do you think those stories are true?" she asked, breaking the silence. "What stories?" Alex replied, keeping his voice steady. "Bigfoot, missing hikers, all that stuff the ranger said." Alex smirked. "Come on. It's just a bunch of campfire tales to scare people. Nothing we can't handle." Before Emily could respond, a loud snap echoed from the darkness beyond their firelight. Both of them froze, their heads whipping toward the sound. Alex grabbed his rifle and stood, his heart pounding. "Probably an animal," he whispered. "Stay by the fire." He stepped cautiously toward the edge of the clearing, the rifle raised. The firelight didn't reach far, and the forest beyond was an inky black. Another snap, closer this time, made him stop. "Alex," Emily called softly, her voice trembling. "What is it?" "I don't know," he replied, his grip tightening on the rifle. But deep down, he had a sinking feeling that whatever was out there wasn't an ordinary animal. Alex's breath hung in the cold air as he peered into the darkness, his rifle steady against his shoulder. The fire behind him cast long shadows that seemed to dance at the edge of the clearing. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to stay alert. Whatever had made that sound was close. "Stay by the fire," he whispered again, glancing back at Emily. She nodded, her face pale as she gripped a flashlight tightly. The forest felt alive, but not in the way it should. It was as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, watching. Another crack came, this time to Alex's left. He pivoted smoothly, the barrel of his rifle pointing toward the source. And then he saw it. A figure loomed just beyond the fire's reach. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and an impossibly large frame. Coarse, dark fur covered its body, and its glowing yellow eyes pierced the shadows. Alex's stomach twisted as he realized it was staring directly at him. "Emily," he said in a low, controlled voice, "get behind me." "What is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just do it." Emily scrambled to her feet, clutching the flashlight. The beam of light shook as she pointed it toward the figure. The creature didn't flinch or retreat. Instead, it stepped forward, its heavy footfall making the ground tremble. "Holy—" Emily gasped, her words cutting off as the flashlight illuminated the creature fully. The thing resembled a man in shape, but was entirely inhuman. Its thick, matted fur and elongated arms gave it an almost primal appearance. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing large, flat teeth that seemed ill-suited for anything but crushing. Alex didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger, the rifle's deafening crack shattering the silence. The bullet hit the creature square in the chest, but instead of falling, it stumbled back with a grunt, more surprised than hurt. "Run!" Alex shouted, grabbing Emily's arm. They bolted toward the opposite end of the clearing, their gear forgotten. Behind them, the creature let out a guttural roar, an earth-shaking sound that sent chills down Alex's spine. More than the roar, though, what terrified him was the echo. A second, then a third roar, answering from different directions. "There's more of them," Alex yelled, adrenaline surging through his veins. He tightened his grip on Emily's arm as they plunged into the forest. Branches whipped at their faces, and the undergrowth snagged their boots, but they didn't stop. The creature's heavy footsteps pounded behind them, accompanied by growls and guttural noises that sounded eerily like a language. Emily stumbled, nearly falling, but Alex yanked her upright. "Keep going," he barked, his voice hard. They burst into a small ravine, the walls offering a brief sense of cover. Alex spun, rifle raised, and aimed toward the noise. The shadows shifted as one of the creatures barreled into view. This time, he didn't aim for the chest. The shot rang out and the creature's leg buckled. It howled in pain, collapsing momentarily before dragging itself back upright. Alex's heart sank. These things were relentless. "Move!" he shouted, pulling Emily along. The realization hit him like a freight train. They weren't being hunted. They were being herded. The forest seemed to close in around them as Alex and Emily ran, their breaths ragged and labored. The guttural sounds of the creatures echoed from every direction, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. The realization that they were being herded, not chased, gnawed at Alex's mind. These creatures weren't just animals, they were organized. Emily stumbled again, catching herself against a tree. "Alex, I can't," she panted, tears streaming down her face. "I can't keep running." Alex stopped, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. His own heart was hammering, but he knew they couldn't afford to stop for long. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "We'll get through this. We just need to stay smart and stick together." He scanned their surroundings, the rifle in his hands feeling heavier by the second. The ravine offered a brief respite, with its steep walls forcing any pursuers to approach from one direction. Alex decided to make a stand. "Over here," he said, guiding Emily to a large fallen tree. "We'll use this as cover." Emily dropped behind the log, gripping her flashlight like a weapon. Alex knelt beside her, his rifle aimed toward the darkened trail they had just fled. His other hand reached for his revolver, which he placed within easy reach. The forest fell silent again, too silent. Alex's finger hovered over the trigger as his eyes darted between the trees. He strained to hear anything, a footstep, a growl, the snap of a branch, but all he could hear was the sound of his own breathing and Emily's quiet sobs. Then, from the shadows, a shape moved. "Stay down," Alex whispered, tightening his grip on the rifle. His heart raced as he spotted one of the creatures emerge from the trees, its massive form silhouetted against the faint moonlight. It moved cautiously, its head swiveling as if sniffing the air. Alex aimed for the head this time. He held his breath, steadied his aim, and fired. The crack of the rifle shattered the stillness. The creature recoiled, a spray of blood visible even in the dim light. It fell to the ground with a heavy thud, motionless. Before Alex could feel any sense of victory, another roar erupted from deeper in the forest. 2 more creatures emerged, their movements faster and more aggressive than before. They charged, their eyes glowing with fury. Alex fired again, hitting one in the shoulder. The creature stumbled, but kept coming. He barely had time to grab his revolver as the second one closed in, its long arms reaching toward the log. "Emily, run!" he shouted, firing point blank into the creature's face. It fell backward with a howl, but Alex knew it wasn't over. Emily scrambled to her feet, but the path ahead was blocked by another figure. This one was even larger, its hulking frame almost blending with the shadows. It let out a low, menacing growl as it advanced. Alex stood between Emily and the creature, his rifle empty and his revolver half-loaded. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. The creatures weren't just hunting them, they were toying with them. The enormous creature blocking their path moved slowly, deliberately, as though savoring their fear. Alex's revolver felt light in his hand, too light. 4 shots left, he thought grimly, and at least 3 of them are still standing. Emily clung to his arm, her trembling hand clutching the flashlight. The beam wavered across the creature's face, revealing jagged fur, deep-set eyes, and a wide, flat nose. Its lips curled back to reveal yellowed teeth, and it let out a guttural sound halfway between a growl and a snarl. "Stay calm," Alex whispered, his eyes darting for an escape route. But the other 2 creatures were flanking them, their massive forms visible through the trees. The pack had revealed itself. Alex fired at the closest one, the revolver's roar echoing through the ravine. The bullet struck its shoulder, causing it to reel back with a roar. It didn't go down but hesitated, giving Alex precious seconds. "Move!" he barked, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her away from the log. They bolted up the ravine, their feet pounding against the rocky ground. Behind them, the creatures let out deafening cries, their footsteps thundering in pursuit. Emily stumbled, falling hard against a rock. Alex turned back, grabbing her under the arm and hauling her upright. "Keep going," he urged. "I'm trying," she gasped, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. Her ankle throbbed, but adrenaline pushed her forward. The ravine opened into a dense thicket of trees, offering some cover. Alex led them deeper, weaving through the trunks and listening for the telltale sounds of pursuit. The growls and heavy footsteps were still close, too close. He motioned for Emily to crouch behind a large boulder, then turned to face the direction they'd come. Kneeling, he reloaded his revolver with practiced speed, the metallic clicks loud in the oppressive silence. One of the creatures emerged from the trees, its glowing eyes locking onto Alex. It charged, its massive arms swinging wildly. Alex aimed and fired, hitting it square in the chest. The creature staggered but didn't fall, its momentum carrying it forward. Come on," Alex muttered, taking another shot. This one hit the creature in the throat, and it collapsed with a strangled cry. But before Alex could breathe a sigh of relief, another roar came from his left. The second creature was faster. It lunged before Alex could react, its claws swiping at his side. He threw himself backward, narrowly avoiding the blow, and fired blindly. The shot grazed the creature's arm, making it hesitate. Emily screamed as the third creature, the largest of the group, loomed behind the boulder. Its hand reached for her, but Alex was faster. He dove between them, firing the last round into its eye. The creature roared in pain, its hand slamming into Alex and knocking him to the ground. "Alex!" Emily cried, scrambling to pull him up. "Go!" he yelled, his voice hoarse. He pushed her ahead as the creatures regrouped, their furious roars shaking the forest. Alex and Emily raced deeper into the forest, their breaths ragged and desperate. The night seemed to press down on them, the darkness growing heavier with each step. Behind them, the creature's guttural roars echoed, growing louder and more frenzied. They weren't giving up. "Alex, I can't keep going," Emily gasped, her ankle throbbing with each step. "You don't have a choice," Alex said, his voice hard but determined. He scanned the terrain for anything they could use, a vantage point, a hiding place, a weapon. His rifle was useless now, the ammunition spent, and his revolver was down to a single bullet. Up ahead, the land sloped upward, leading to a cluster of massive boulders. Alex grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her toward them. "We'll make a stand here." The boulders formed a natural barrier, leaving a narrow opening that Alex could defend. He positioned Emily behind the largest rock and handed her his hunting knife. "If anything gets past me, use this." Emily's hand shook as she took the blade. "What if—" "Don't think about that," Alex interrupted. "Just stay quiet and keep low." He turned back to the opening, revolver in hand. The first creature appeared moments later, its hulking frame illuminated by the faint moonlight. It paused at the edge of the clearing, sniffing the air, its yellow eyes scanning the rocks. Alex aimed carefully, waiting for it to step closer. The creature moved slowly, cautiously, as if it knew he was armed. Alex's finger tightened on the trigger, but he hesitated. One bullet wasn't enough to stop all of them. Then a second creature emerged, its movements quicker and more aggressive. It let out a sharp, guttural cry, and the first one charged. Alex fired, the shot hitting the charging creature in the leg. It stumbled but didn't stop, its massive arms swinging wildly as it closed the distance. Alex grabbed a jagged branch from the ground and swung it like a club, striking the creature across the head. It reeled back, stunned. The second creature leapt over the first, its claws aiming for Alex's throat. He ducked, driving the branch upward into its stomach with all his strength. The creature roared in pain but swiped at him, sending him sprawling to the ground. "Alex!" Emily screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos. The first creature recovered, its eyes blazing with fury as it lumbered toward Alex. He rolled to his feet, grabbing a rock and hurling it at the creature's face. The impact caused it to hesitate, buying him precious seconds. "Emily, run!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. But Emily didn't move. She gripped the knife tightly, her eyes wide with terror. The third creature appeared at the edge of the clearing, its massive form dwarfing the others. It let out a deafening roar, and the pack seemed to rally, their movements more coordinated, more deliberate. Alex stood between them and Emily, his hands empty but his resolve unshaken. "You're not taking her," he growled. The creatures advanced, their glowing eyes filled with a predatory hunger. Alex knew this was it. They had to fight or die. The fight felt endless, but Alex's raw determination and improvised weapons kept the creatures at bay just long enough for a sliver of opportunity to appear. Spotting a narrow cave entrance half hidden by dense underbrush nearby, Alex grabbed Emily's arm and pulled her toward it. "Inside now!" he barked, his voice leaving no room for argument. Emily ducked into the cave, her flashlight casting shaky beams across the rough walls. Alex followed, dragging a heavy branch to cover the entrance. He pressed his back against the rock, panting as the sounds of the creatures grew louder outside. "They'll find us," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Maybe," Alex said, crouching to reload his revolver with the single bullet he had left. "But they won't get us easily." The cave smelled damp and earthy, its depths disappearing into inky blackness. Emily turned her flashlight forward, illuminating bones scattered across the floor. Some were old, weathered to the point of crumbling, but others were disturbingly fresh. Shreds of clothing clung to a few of them, remnants of hikers who had come before them. "Oh my God," Emily choked, stepping back. Alex's jaw tightened. "This is their den," he said grimly. "They've been bringing people here." The realization hit him like a gut punch. The creatures weren't just attacking at random, they were hunting systematically. The stories of missing hikers suddenly made terrible sense. These weren't the actions of animals driven by instinct. The creatures were calculating, ruthless predators. The pounding outside grew louder, and one of the creatures let out a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of claws raking against stone. "Stay behind me," Alex said, his voice low but firm. He aimed the revolver at the entrance, ready to take down the first thing that came through. Emily gripped the knife, her knuckles white. "What do we do if they get in?" she whispered. Alex didn't answer. He didn't want to admit they had no plan beyond fighting until they couldn't anymore. The growls grew closer, and then a massive arm reached through the gap in the branches Alex had used to block the entrance. He fired, the shot echoing like thunder in the confined space. The arm jerked back, but the roaring outside only intensified. "They'll keep coming," Emily said, her voice breaking. "We'll hold them off as long as we can," Alex replied. But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. They were out of time, out of options, and nearly out of hope. A sudden sound from deeper in the cave made them both freeze. It wasn't the guttural growl of the creatures, but something far more unsettling, a low, rumbling noise that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. "What was that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Alex turned, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the darkness beyond the flashlight's reach. "I don't know," he said, his grip tightening on the revolver, "but I think we're not alone in here either." The low rumble from the cave's depths grew louder, reverberating through the confined space like the growl of some ancient beast. Alex's grip tightened on his revolver as his heart pounded in his chest. Whatever was in the cave wasn't part of their plan, and it was moving toward them. Emily aimed her flashlight into the darkness, her breathing shallow and uneven. The beam flickered over jagged walls and deep shadows, revealing nothing at first. Then, just as Alex began to relax, a pair of glowing yellow eyes reflected back at them. "No," Emily whispered, stumbling back. Another creature, larger than the ones outside, stepped into the flashlight's beam. Its fur was darker, its eyes more intelligent, and its massive frame blocked most of the cave tunnel. This wasn't just another member of the pack. It was their leader. "Stay behind me," Alex said, his voice firm despite the fear coursing through him. Before the creature could close the distance, the sounds of the pack outside grew frenzied. The branches blocking the entrance splintered as one of the creatures forced its way in. Alex spun, firing his last bullet into the intruder's chest. The creature staggered but didn't fall, its roars deafening in the confined space. "Move deeper into the cave," Alex shouted, grabbing Emily's arm. "But," she began, glancing toward the massive figure blocking the other end of the tunnel. "We don't have a choice," Alex snapped, dragging her past the fresh kill. The two sprinted into the depths of the cave, the flickering flashlight beam guiding them. The walls narrowed, forcing them to squeeze through tight gaps. Behind them, the leader followed, its guttural growls echoing ominously. The tunnel opened into a larger cavern, and Alex quickly assessed their surroundings. Jagged stalagmites jutted from the floor, and a small pool of water glistened in the dim light. It wasn't much, but it offered a chance to make a stand. "Get up there," Alex said, pointing to a raised ledge on the far side of the cavern. Emily climbed as fast as she could, using the natural footholds in the rock. Alex grabbed a sharp piece of stone from the ground, his makeshift weapon pitiful against the hulking figure emerging from the tunnel. The leader Bigfoot entered the cavern, its low growl resonating like a warning. It was followed by two more creatures, smaller, but no less menacing. Alex stood his ground, positioning himself between the monsters and Emily. "Come on, you bastards," he muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped the stone. The creatures advanced slowly, their glowing eyes fixed on him. One lunged, and Alex sidestepped, slashing at its arm. The stone tore through fur and flesh, eliciting a roar of pain. The second charged immediately after, and Alex struck again, aiming for its neck. The leader watched, its intelligent gaze calculating Alex's movements. It growled, and the two wounded creatures fell back, regrouping. Alex realized too late what was happening. They were baiting him, tiring him out. Above him, Emily screamed, pointing frantically. "Alex, behind you!" He turned just as the leader lunged, its massive hand closing around his arm. The force threw him to the ground, the stone clattering away. Alex struggled, kicking and punching, but the creature's strength was overwhelming. The leader's grip was crushing, its massive hand pinning Alex to the ground. His muscles strained as he fought against its immense strength, but it was like wrestling a force of nature. The creature snarled, its glowing eyes filled with malice as it leaned closer. "Let him go!" Emily's voice rang out from above. Alex turned his head just in time to see her holding a jagged rock over her head. With all her strength, she hurled it at the leader. The rock struck the creature square in the temple, and it roared in pain, its grip momentarily loosening. Alex didn't waste a second. He grabbed a sharp piece of debris from the ground and drove it into the creature's hand. It let out a guttural howl and released him, staggering backward. "Emily, jump down," Alex shouted, scrambling to his feet. Without hesitation, Emily leapt from the ledge, landing hard beside Alex. Her flashlight clattered to the ground but miraculously stayed on, its beam illuminating the chaotic scene. The other two creatures hesitated, clearly wary of their wounded leader. "We need to go," Emily yelled, clutching Alex's arm. "No arguments here," Alex muttered, grabbing the flashlight and leading her toward the far side of the cavern. His mind raced as he scanned for an exit. Knowing the creatures wouldn't hesitate for long, a narrow crevice caught his eye, a small opening in the rock that looked just wide enough for them to squeeze through. "Over there," he said, pointing. The leader roared again, regaining its footing. Blood dripped from the wound in its hand, but its fury seemed to override its pain. It charged, its massive frame shaking the ground beneath them. Alex shoved Emily toward the crevice. "Go, I'll hold them off." "I'm not leaving you," she protested, but Alex gave her a firm push. "Move," he barked, turning to face the charging creature. Armed with nothing but his fists and the flashlight, Alex braced himself. The leader lunged, its claws swiping inches from his face. He ducked, swinging the flashlight with all his strength. The beam shattered on impact, plunging the cavern into near darkness, but the blow bought him enough time to dive toward the crevice. Emily was already halfway through, her hands clawing at the jagged rock as she pulled herself forward. Alex followed, squeezing into the tight space just as the leader slammed into the opening behind him. Its massive arms reached in, claws scraping against the rock, but it couldn't fit. "Keep going," Alex urged, the sound of his voice bouncing off the narrow walls. The two crawled through the tunnel, the creature's enraged growls echoing behind them. Sharp rocks tore at their clothes and skin, but they didn't stop. Adrenaline pushed them forward, their only thought being to escape. Finally, they emerged into the open air. The first light of dawn painted the forest in soft hues, a stark contrast to the nightmare they'd just endured. Alex helped Emily to her feet, both of them bleeding and gasping for breath. Behind them, the growls faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The creatures weren't following. "We made it," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. Alex nodded, his eyes scanning the forest. "For now," he said, his voice grim, "let's find help before they change their minds." The sun climbed higher as Alex and Emily stumbled through the forest, their steps uneven and unsteady. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through them, but the creatures didn't reappear. Still, Alex kept Emily close, his eyes scanning every shadow. "We need to find a ranger station," Alex said, his voice hoarse. "They have to believe us." Emily didn't respond, her face pale and streaked with dirt and tears. Her ankle throbbed with each step, but she didn't complain. Survival was the only thing keeping her moving. Hours passed, and the forest began to thin. A dirt road appeared in the distance, the sight of it filling them with a flicker of hope. Alex quickened his pace, his arm steadying Emily as they moved toward it. Soon the sound of an approaching vehicle reached their ears. A park ranger's truck rounded the bend, and Alex flagged it down, waving his arms frantically. The truck screeched to a halt, and a ranger stepped out, his expression shifting from annoyance to alarm as he took in their disheveled appearance. "Are you two okay?" the ranger asked, rushing toward them. "We were attacked," Alex said, his voice firm despite his exhaustion. "There are creatures out there. They killed hikers. We barely escaped." The ranger's brows furrowed. "Creatures? What are you talking about?" Emily grabbed the ranger's arm, her eyes wide with desperation. "They're real. They're huge, and they're smart. You have to do something." The ranger hesitated, clearly skeptical. "Let's get you both to the station. You look like you've been through hell." Inside the truck, Alex and Emily recounted their ordeal as best they could. The ranger listened, his expression unreadable, but when Alex mentioned the cave and the remains they'd seen, the man's face darkened. "We've had reports of missing hikers in that area," he admitted. "Search teams went out but found nothing. If what you're saying is true, this changes everything." "It's true," Alex said firmly. "They're out there and they're hunting people." When they arrived at the station, a team of medics examined them while the ranger made calls. Alex could hear fragments of the conversation. mentions of search teams, restricted areas, and containment protocols. It was clear their story wasn't being dismissed outright. As the day wore on, Alex and Emily sat in the station, their wounds bandaged and their nerves frayed. Emily leaned against Alex, her head on his shoulder. "Do you think they'll do anything about it?" she asked quietly. Alex hesitated, staring out the window at the dense forest. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if they don't, someone else will disappear. Maybe a lot of someone else's." The ranger returned, his face serious. "We're organizing a search team to investigate the cave. You've done all you can. For now, get some rest." But rest didn't come easy. As Alex and Emily prepared to leave the park, the weight of what they'd seen lingered. Every shadow in the trees seemed to hold a threat, and every sound made them flinch. Driving away from Yellowstone, Emily glanced back at the towering pines, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think they'll stop?" Alex gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "Not unless someone makes them." The road stretched ahead, but the forest behind them felt alive, watching, waiting. They had escaped, for now, but Alex knew the creatures were still out there, and they wouldn't stop hunting. Not ever. Alright, so this all started about a year ago. I'm just an average guy, nothing special. I work a regular job, hang out with friends, and yeah, spend too much time on Reddit. But then something really weird happened, and it all began with my best friend, Mikey. Mikey's always been the thrill-seeker type. He's into extreme sports, urban exploring, all that kind of stuff. So, it wasn't too shocking when he started talking about the dark web. At first, I didn't take it seriously. I thought it was just another one of his crazy phases. He'd get obsessed with something for a while and then move on. But this time, it was different. We were chilling at his place one Friday night, having a few beers when he brought it up. "Hey man, have you ever checked out the dark web?" he asked, eyes gleaming with excitement. I laughed. "Yeah, isn't that where all the creeps and criminals hang out?" "Sort of," he said, leaning in closer. "But it's also a lot more than that. There's a whole hidden world out there. You can find stuff you wouldn't believe." I took another sip of my beer, curious but skeptical. "Like what?" Mikey's face lit up. "You can buy anything. Drugs, guns, fake IDs. But there's also some really creepy stuff. I found this forum where people share their darkest secrets, and another one with videos of urban legends that are supposed to be real. It's insane." I was intrigued but also a bit wary. "And you've been on there? Isn't it dangerous?" "Only if you're an idiot about it," he said with a grin. "You just need to know how to stay anonymous. I've been exploring it for a while now and nothing bad has happened to me." That's when I started to think maybe the dark web was more than just a scary story. Mikey showed me how to get on it safely, using Tor and a bunch of other security stuff. At first I was just curious, browsing around. But as the weeks went by, I got more and more into it. One night I was home alone, bored out of my mind, when I decided to do something really stupid. I was on one of those dark web marketplaces Mikey had told me about, and I saw this ad that caught my eye. "Rare USB stick for sale. Contains unique and mysterious content." The description was vague, but something about it made me curious. It was only $50, so I figured, why not? I clicked on the ad, and a few minutes later, I had bought it using Bitcoin. The seller promised discreet shipping, and a few days later the package arrived. The USB stick looked normal, just a plain black drive. I plugged it into my laptop, half expecting it to be a scam or full of viruses. But what I found was way worse. There was one folder on the stick called Memories. Inside there were dozens of photos and videos. I clicked on the first photo, and my heart almost stopped. It was a picture of me at a playground when I was about 5. I was wearing this red jacket with a dinosaur patch. I had this big smile, missing my front teeth. My hands started shaking as I looked through more photos. They were all of me, at different ages. Some were just normal, like me playing in the yard with my dog, but others were really creepy, photos of me sleeping, totally unaware. I quickly closed the folder, my mind racing. Who the hell took these photos? And why? I felt sick, like someone had been watching me my whole life. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe it was someone else who looked like me. But I knew that wasn't true. Then, I made the mistake of opening one of the videos. It started with a grainy black and white image of my childhood bedroom. The camera was in the corner, pointed at my bed. I watched as a younger me, maybe 8 or 9, crawled into bed and fell asleep. The video went on forever, just me sleeping. Then the camera started moving. I realized someone was holding it. They walked slowly towards my bed, the image getting shakier. They stood over me, watching me sleep, then reached out and brushed my hair from my face. I slammed my laptop shut, my heart pounding. I felt like I was going to throw up. Who had been in my room filming me while I slept? And how did they get these videos? I tried to calm down, telling myself it was a sick joke. Maybe Mikey was messing with me. But that didn't make sense. Mikey didn't have access to my childhood home, and he wouldn't have videos of me as a kid. I spent the rest of the night freaking out, checking the locks on my doors and windows, looking out into the dark to see if anyone was there. I didn't sleep at all, my mind racing with fear and questions. The next morning, I called Mikey. "Dude, you won't believe what I found," I said, my voice shaking. "What is it?" he asked, sounding worried. I told him everything, the photos, the videos, the feeling of being watched. There was a long silence on the other end. "Man, that's seriously messed up," he finally said. "You need to get rid of that USB stick. Burn it, smash it, just get rid of it." "I know," I whispered. "But I need to find out who did this. I need to know why." "Look, maybe it's better if you don't know," Mikey said. "Some things are better left alone." But I couldn't let it go. I had to know the truth, no matter how disturbing it was. Little did I know, my search for answers was just beginning, and it would take me down a path of horror I could never have imagined. After that call with Mikey, I was a mess. I spent the whole day trying to act normal, but inside I was freaking out. Every noise made me jump, and I kept checking over my shoulder like someone was following me. That night I couldn't stop thinking about those photos and videos. Who had taken them? Why did they have them? I knew I had to find out more. I decided to look through the USB stick again, hoping to find some kind of clue. I plugged it back in and opened the memories folder. This time I looked at the files more closely. Each photo and video had a timestamp, and I realized they were all taken on significant days in my life. Birthdays, holidays, even my first day of school. It felt like someone had been tracking me, documenting my life. The thought made my skin crawl, but I had to keep digging. I noticed a subfolder called Documents. Inside, there were files with my name on them, medical records, school reports, even some of my drawings from when I was a kid. It was like someone had been collecting every piece of information about me. One file stood out. It was a text document named Notes. I opened it, and what I read made my blood run cold. The notes were detailed observations about me, written in a way that made it clear the person knew me intimately. They mentioned things I had never told anyone, my fears, my favorite hiding spots, even conversations I had with my parents. I had to know who was behind this. I called Mikey again, desperate for his help. "Mikey, I found more stuff. Someone has been watching me my whole life. They know everything about me." "Jesus, man," Mikey said. "This is way beyond anything I've heard about on the dark web. You need to go to the police." "I can't," I said. "What if they think I'm crazy? Or worse, what if they don't believe me and this person finds out I went to the cops?" All right, Mikey said, trying to calm me down. "Let's think about this. There has to be a way to trace the USB stick. Maybe the seller left some kind of clue. Did you get any contact info when you bought it?" I checked my emails and found the transaction details. The seller's username was Watcher1987. There was no real contact info, just an encrypted email address. I felt a mix of fear and anger. This person had been invading my life, and now I had a lead, even if it was a small one. Mikey, I found the seller's username, Watcher1987, but I don't know what to do with it. All right, let me think, Mikey said. Maybe we can find them on one of the forums. People like that always leave some kind of trail. Give me some time to dig around. While Mikey searched the forums, I decided to do some digging of my own. I couldn't just sit around and wait. I went through the notes again, looking for any hints about the Watcher's identity. One entry caught my eye. It mentioned a park I used to go to with my parents, a place we stopped visiting after my mom passed away. I hadn't been there in years, but something about the note felt off. It mentioned a specific tree where I used to hide my toys. I decided to check it out, hoping maybe there was something there, some clue the Watcher had left behind. The park was eerily quiet when I arrived. It felt strange being there after so many years. I made my way to the tree mentioned in the notes. I started digging around the base, feeling a bit ridiculous, but driven by a desperate need for answers. After a few minutes, my fingers hit something hard. I pulled out a small rusted metal box. My heart was pounding as I pried it open. Inside, there were more photos of me, along with a few small items: an old toy car, a bracelet my mom gave me, and a note. The note was written in the same handwriting as the document on the USB stick. "You're getting closer," it read. "But are you ready for the truth?" I felt a literal chills down my spine. This person was playing a game with me, and I had no choice but to play along. I took the box and hurried back to my car, my mind racing. I had more questions than answers, but I was determined to get to the bottom of this. When I got home, Mikey called me. "I found something," he said, his voice tense. Watcher1987 has been active on several forums. They've posted a lot of creepy stuff, but nothing that points directly to you. However, I found a thread where they hinted at meeting up with people. It's a long shot, but maybe we can track them down through one of their contacts. "Thanks, Mikey," I said, feeling a bit of hope. "Let's do it. I need to find this person and put an end to this." As we hung up, I realized this was just the beginning. I was diving into a dark world I knew nothing about, and the more I uncovered, the more dangerous it felt. But I couldn't stop now. I had to know the truth, no matter the cost. Mikey and I spent the next few days diving deep into the dark web forums, trying to track down any leads connected to Watcher1987. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack, but we were determined. Every spare moment was spent scrolling through posts, chatting with sketchy users, and piecing together bits of information. One night, Mikey called me, sounding excited. "I think I found something. There's this user, Nightstalker88, who seems to know Watcher1987. They've exchanged messages in several threads about meeting up in person. It looks like they have some kind of connection. Do you think we can contact Nightstalker88?" I asked, my heart pounding. "It's risky," Mikey said, "but it's our best shot at finding out more about Watcher1987. I'll send a message and see if we get a response." We crafted a careful message, pretending to be interested in their creepy hobbies to avoid suspicion. Then we waited. It felt like an eternity, but after a couple of days, Nightstalker88 replied. "Who are you?" The message read. "Why do you want to meet?" Mikey and I had planned for this. We spun a story about being new to the dark web, fascinated by their posts, and eager to learn more. After some back and forth, Nightstalker88 agreed to meet us in a chat room at a specific time. When the time came, Mikey and I were ready. The chat room was dark, with only a few users present. Nightstalker88's username appeared, and we started chatting. We kept it casual at first, talking about dark web stuff to build trust. Then we steered the conversation toward Watcher1987. "So we heard you know Watcher1987 pretty well," Mikey typed. "We've seen their posts, and they seem interesting." Nightstalker88's response was cautious. "Yeah, we go way back. What do you want with them?" I took a deep breath and typed, "We're curious about their projects. We've seen some of their work, and it's fascinating. We want to know more." There was a long pause. Finally, Night Stalker 88 replied, Watcher 1987 is different. They're into some really dark stuff. If you're serious about meeting them, you need to be careful. We assured Night Stalker 88 that we were serious, and after more convincing, they agreed to set up a meeting. They gave us a location, an abandoned building on the outskirts of town, and a time to be there. The day of the meeting, Mikey and I were both nervous. We drove out to the location, an old rundown warehouse that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The place was creepy as hell, but we had come this far and we couldn't back out now. We parked a little distance away and walked to the building. The door was slightly ajar, and we slipped inside, our footsteps echoing in the empty space. We waited, every creak and rustle making us jumpy. After what felt like forever, we heard footsteps. A figure emerged from the shadows. They were wearing a hooded jacket, and their face was obscured. "You must be the new guys," they said in a low voice. "Yeah," Mikey replied. "Are you Night Stalker 88? The figure nodded. "Follow me." We followed them deeper into the building, through a maze of hallways and rooms. Finally, we entered a room with a single chair and a small table. On the table was a laptop. The figure gestured for us to sit. "Watcher 1987 will be here soon," they said. "But first I need to know if you're really serious about this. Once you go down this path, there's no turning back." "We're serious," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to know what Watcher 1987 is all about." The figure nodded and stepped back, fading into the shadows. We sat in silence, waiting. After a few minutes, the laptop screen flickered to life. A face appeared on the screen, distorted and hidden by shadows. "Welcome," the distorted voice said. "I hear you're interested in my work." "Yes," Mikey said. "We want to know more about you." The figure on the screen chuckled. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing. But if you really want to know, I'll tell you. I've been watching you, both of you, and I've been waiting for this moment." My blood ran cold. This wasn't just about the USB stick. This person knew us, had been following us. "Why?" I asked. "Why have you been watching us?" The figure leaned closer to the camera, their eyes piercing through the screen. "Because you are interesting. Because you are part of a larger experiment. And now you're in too deep to back out." The screen went black and the room plunged into darkness. Mikey and I sat there, stunned and terrified. We had stepped into a nightmare, and there was no waking up. The truth was out there, and it was darker and more twisted than we could have ever imagined. After that strange meeting, Mikey and I were both freaked out. We decided we had to dig deeper and find out who Watcher 1987 really was. We spent the next few days glued to our screens, searching through dark web forums and trying to find any clues. One night, Mikey called me, sounding excited. "Dude, I think I found something. There's this user, Night Stalker 88, who seems to know Watcher 1987. They've talked about meeting up a few times. Do you think we can contact Night Stalker 88? I asked, feeling a mix of fear and curiosity. "It's risky," Mikey said, "but we don't have many options. I'll send them a message and see if they respond." We spent some time crafting a careful message. We pretended to be new to the dark web, interested in the creepy stuff they were into. After a day or so, Night Stalker 88 replied, "Who are you?" The message read, "Why do you want to meet?" We told them we were curious about their posts and wanted to learn more. After some back and forth, they agreed to set up a meeting in a chat room at a specific time. When the time came, Mikey and I were ready. The chat room was dark, with only a few users. Night Stalker 88 showed up and we started chatting. We kept it casual at first, talking about general dark web stuff. Then we brought up Watcher 1987. "So we heard you know Watcher 1987 pretty well," Mikey typed. "We've seen their posts, and they seem interesting." Night Stalker 88's response was cautious. "Yeah, we go way back. What do you want with them?" I took a deep breath and typed, "We've seen some of their work, and it's fascinating. We want to know more." There was a long pause. Finally, Night Stalker 88 replied, "Watcher 1987 is different. They're into some really dark stuff. If you're serious about meeting them, you need to be careful." We assured Night Stalker 88 that we were serious, and after more convincing, they agreed to set up a meeting. They gave us a location, an abandoned building on the edge of town, and a time to be there. The day of the meeting, Mikey and I were both nervous. We drove out to the location, an old creepy warehouse that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The place was creepy as hell, but we had come this far and couldn't back out now. We parked a little distance away and walked to the building. The door was slightly open and we slipped inside. It was dark and dusty, and every sound made us jumpy. After a few minutes, we heard footsteps. A figure emerged from the shadows, wearing a hooded jacket. Their face was hidden. "You must be the new guys," they said in a low voice. "Yeah," Mikey replied. "Are you Night Stalker 88? The figure nodded. "Follow me." We followed them through a maze of hallways and rooms. Finally, we entered a room with a single chair and a small table with a laptop on it. The figure gestured for us to sit. "Watcher 1987 will be here soon," they said. "But first, I need to know if you're really serious about this. Once you go down this path, there's no turning back." "We're serious," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to know what Watcher 1987 is all about." The figure nodded and stepped back, disappearing into the shadows. We sat in silence, waiting. After a few minutes, the laptop screen flickered to life. A face appeared on the screen, distorted and hidden by shadows. "Welcome," the distorted voice said. "I hear you're interested in my work." "Yes," Mikey said. "We want to know more about you." The figure on the screen chuckled. "Curiosity is dangerous, but since you've come this far, I'll tell you. I've been watching you, both of you, and I've been waiting for this moment." My blood ran cold. This wasn't just about the USB stick. This person knew us, had been following us. "Why?" I asked. "Why have you been watching us?" The figure leaned closer to the camera. "Because you are interesting. Because you are part of a larger experiment, and now you're in too deep to back out." The screen went black and the room plunged into darkness. We sat there, stunned and terrified. We had stepped into a nightmare, and there was no waking up. The truth was out there, and it was darker and more twisted than we could have ever imagined. When we got home, we tried to process what had just happened. "This is messed up," Mikey said, pacing back and forth. "We need to figure out who this person is and why they're doing this." "I know," I replied, feeling overwhelmed. "But where do we start? They could be anyone." "We need to go through everything on that USB stick again," Mikey suggested. "There has to be something we missed." We spent the next few hours going through every photo, video, and document. It was exhausting, but we were determined to find any clue that could lead us to Watcher 1987. Finally, Mikey found something. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a photo. It was a picture of me at a park, taken from a distance. In the background, there was a faint reflection in a window. We zoomed in, and our hearts skipped a beat. The reflection showed a man holding a camera, his face partially visible. "Do you recognize him?" Mikey asked. "I think so," I said, my mind racing. "He looks familiar, but I can't place him." We printed out the photo and took it to my parents' house, hoping they could help. My dad looked at it and went pale. "That's Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice shaking. "He was our neighbor when you were a kid. He moved away suddenly years ago." I felt a chill run down my spine. Mr. Thompson had always been a bit odd, but I never thought much of it. "Do you know where he moved to?" I asked. "No," my dad replied. "He just disappeared one day. We never heard from him again." Mikey and I left my parents' house, more determined than ever to find Mr. Thompson. We spent days tracking down leads, calling old neighbors, and searching online records. Finally, we found an address linked to his name in a nearby town. We drove there, arriving at a rundown house at the edge of town. It looked abandoned, but we decided to check it out. As we approached the front door, we noticed it was slightly open. We pushed it open and stepped inside, the air thick with dust and neglect. The house was filled with old furniture and stacks of boxes. We searched the rooms, looking for any sign of Mr. Thompson. In one of the back rooms, we found a small office with a computer. The screen was dark, but when we moved the mouse, it came to life, displaying a series of folders labeled with dates and names. We opened the most recent folder, and our hearts sank. Inside were photos and videos of me and Mikey, taken over the past few months. There were also detailed notes about our activities, similar to the ones on the USB stick. "This is insane," Mikey said, his voice shaking. "He's been watching us this whole time." Suddenly, we heard a noise from the hallway. We turned to see Mr. Thompson standing there, a twisted smile on his face. "I see you found my little project," he said, his voice cold and detached. We froze, fear paralyzing us. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Because it's fascinating," he replied. "Watching you, documenting your lives, it's like a never-ending story, and now you're part of it forever." Before we could react, he lunged at us. We fought back, adrenaline pumping through our veins. Somehow we managed to overpower him and escape, running to the car and driving away as fast as we could. We went straight to the police, handing over all the evidence we had. Mr. Thompson was arrested and an investigation was launched. It turned out he had been doing this to other people too, stalking them, collecting their photos and videos and creating detailed dossiers on their lives. Even though he was behind bars, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My life had changed forever. The sense of safety and privacy I once had was gone, replaced by a constant feeling of unease. Mikey and I tried to move on, but the trauma was still there. After Mr. Thompson was arrested, Mikey and I tried to go back to our normal lives. It was hard, but we were getting by. Then, one afternoon, I got a call from the police. It was Detective Harris, the guy handling our case. "Hey, I need to let you know something," he said, sounding serious. "Mr. Thompson escaped from custody. We're doing everything we can to find him, but you and Mikey need to be very careful. We think he might come after you." I felt a chill run down my spine. "How did he escape?" "He overpowered a guard during a transfer," Harris explained. "We don't know how he managed it, but he's very dangerous. Please stay alert and call us if you see anything suspicious." After I hung up, I immediately called Mikey. "Dude, Thompson escaped. The cops think he might come after us." Mikey was silent for a moment. "This is bad. We need to be extra careful. Lock all your doors and windows. Keep your phone with you all the time." We both went into full-on panic mode. I checked all the locks in my apartment, installed extra security cameras, and made sure my phone was always charged and nearby. But even with all these precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Days passed, then weeks, and there was no sign of Mr. Thompson. The police were still searching, but they had no leads. Mikey and I tried to stay vigilant, but the constant fear was wearing us down. Every time the phone rang or there was a knock at the door, my heart would race. One night, I was getting ready for bed when my phone buzzed with a notification from one of my security cameras. Someone was at my front door. I froze, heart pounding. I grabbed a baseball bat and slowly approached the door, checking the camera feed on my phone. To my relief, it was just a delivery guy dropping off a package. I sighed and tried to relax, but it reminded me of how on edge I was. I couldn't let my guard down for a second. The next morning, Mikey called me. "I think I saw someone outside my window last night," he said, his voice shaky. "I'm not sure if it was him, but it freaked me out." "Did you call the police?" I asked. "Yeah, they came by but didn't find anything. I'm starting to feel like I'm losing my mind." We both were. The constant stress and fear were taking a toll. I decided to stay over at Mikey's place for a few days so we could watch each other's backs. While at Mikey's, we tried to distract ourselves with movies and games, but the tension was always there. We kept checking the windows, jumping at every little noise. It felt like we were prisoners in our own home. One night, while Mikey was in the shower, I heard a noise outside. I peeked through the blinds and saw a figure standing near the edge of the yard, watching the house. My heart nearly stopped. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator what was happening. The figure moved closer, and I could see it was definitely Mr. Thompson. He had this twisted smile on his face, like he was enjoying the fear he was causing. I banged on the bathroom door, shouting for Mikey to come out. By the time Mikey rushed out, Thompson was gone. The police arrived minutes later, but once again they found nothing. It was like he was toying with us, letting us know he could get to us any time he wanted. Detective Harris pulled us aside. "We're going to increase patrols in the area and put a unit outside your house. But you guys need to be ready to leave at a moment's notice if we think he's closing in." We nodded, feeling utterly helpless. The police presence was somewhat reassuring, but the fact that Thompson was still out there made it hard to relax. We packed emergency bags and kept them by the door, ready to bolt if things got worse. Over the next few days, the police maintained a constant watch, but Thompson didn't show up again. Mikey and I tried to go about our lives, but it was hard to focus on anything other than the fear. Every night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was out there, planning his next move. Then one evening, while we were eating dinner, the power suddenly went out. We sat in darkness, the silence almost deafening. Mikey grabbed a flashlight, and we cautiously made our way to the fuse box. But before we could get there, we heard a window shatter from the back of the house. Our blood ran cold. Thompson was inside. We didn't have time to think. We bolted for the front door, grabbing our emergency bags and running out into the night. We didn't stop running until we reached the police car parked down the street. The officers quickly took us to a safe house, and we stayed there for what felt like forever. The police launched a massive manhunt, but days turned into weeks with no sign of Thompson. The fear that he could strike at any moment never left us. We were trapped in a cycle of fear and anxiety, knowing that as long as Thompson was out there, we would never be safe. The police kept us updated, but the lack of progress was frustrating. We couldn't live our lives, always looking over our shoulders, waiting for something to happen. One morning, Detective Harris called us to the station. "We have a lead," he said. "There was a sighting of Thompson a few towns over. We're moving you to another safe house just to be sure." We packed up again and moved to the new location. It was more secure, with guards posted outside, but the fear remained. The feeling of being hunted was overwhelming. Every time the phone rang, every knock on the door sent waves of panic through me. Mikey and I spent our days trying to distract ourselves, but it was hard. We talked about everything we had been through, trying to make sense of it all. The fear was always there, though, lurking in the background. Weeks went by with no new developments. The police were still searching, but Thompson seemed to have vanished. The constant state of alert was taking its toll on both of us. Sleep was a distant memory, and even the simplest tasks felt impossible. One night there was a loud knock on the door. My heart raced as I grabbed a bat and Mikey picked up a knife. We cautiously approached the door, ready for the worst. But it was just Detective Harris with some news. "We think we found him," he said. "He was spotted near an old cabin in the woods. We're closing in, but I wanted to let you know so you can be ready to move if needed." We nodded, feeling a mix of relief and dread. The idea of Thompson being caught was a huge weight off our shoulders, but the thought of him being so close was terrifying. The next few days were tense. The police were on high alert, and we were ready to move at a moment's notice. Then one morning we got the call. "We got him," Harris said. "Thompson is in custody. You're safe now." The relief was overwhelming. We could finally breathe again. But the experience had changed us. The fear, the constant looking over our shoulders, it had left its mark. We knew it would take time to feel normal again, but at least the nightmare was over. Mikey and I spent the next few days trying to adjust to the idea of being safe. It wasn't easy, but we were determined to move on. We had survived something truly terrifying, and we knew we could get through anything as long as we stuck together. Just when Mikey and I thought we could finally relax, something new happened. A few days after Thompson was caught, I got a letter in the mail. There was no return address, and the handwriting looked strange. My heart started racing as I opened it. The letter said, "Thought you could escape? Thompson wasn't working alone. We know where you are. Pay us $10,000 or we'll make your life a living hell. You have 1 week." I showed the letter to Mikey, and we called Detective Harris right away. He told us to come to the station immediately. When we got there, we handed over the letter. Harris read it and got really serious. "This is serious," he said, "but we'll handle it. We'll increase patrols around your safe house and start an investigation to find out who sent this." Mikey and I felt a bit better, but still scared. The idea that someone else was involved was terrifying. It felt like this nightmare would never end. The police said they'd keep us updated, but waiting was hard. Over the next few days, we barely slept. Every noise outside, every knock on the door made us jump. We couldn't stop thinking about the letter and what might happen next. We were constantly looking over our shoulders, worried that someone was watching us. Then, one evening, my phone rang. It was Detective Harris. "We've got some good news," he said. "We tracked down the person who sent you that letter. Thompson had a small group of people working with him. They've all been arrested." I felt so relieved. "So, it's over? We're safe now?" "Yes," Harris replied. "We've got everyone involved in custody. You can finally breathe easy." I thanked Harris and hung up, feeling like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I turned to Mikey, who had been waiting anxiously for the news. "They caught them. Everyone who worked with Thompson is behind bars." Mikey let out a deep breath. "Thank God. I don't think I could have handled much more of this." For the first time in weeks, we felt a sense of calm. The constant fear and anxiety began to fade. We knew it would take time to fully recover from everything that had happened, but we finally felt like we could start moving forward. In the following days, Mikey and I began to rebuild our lives. We still checked in with each other frequently, making sure we were both okay. The experience had brought us closer, and we knew we could rely on each other no matter what. The police kept us updated on the case, and it was reassuring to know that Thompson and his accomplices were all in custody. We took comfort in the fact that they would be held accountable for their actions. Slowly but surely, we started to feel normal again. The paranoia began to fade, and we no longer jumped at every little noise. We could finally sleep through the night without waking up in a panic. One evening, as we sat on Mikey's porch watching the sunset, we talked about everything that had happened. "Can you believe it's finally over?" Mikey asked, shaking his head. "I know," I replied. "It's been a crazy ride, but we made it through." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, just appreciating the peace and quiet. The fear that had haunted us for so long was finally gone. We knew we still had some healing to do, but for the first time in a long time, we felt truly safe. Life gradually returned to normal. We got back to our routines, went back to work, and started to enjoy the little things again. The shadow of Mr. Thompson and his twisted game had finally been lifted, and we could move forward with our lives. Looking back, it was a terrifying experience, but it also showed us how strong we were. Mikey and I had faced our worst fears and come out the other side. And now, we were ready to put the past behind us and look to the future with hope and confidence. The dark web had shown us its horrors, but we had survived. And in that survival, we found a new appreciation for the simple, everyday moments that make life worth living. Alright, so let me tell you about the most messed up thing that ever happened to me and my friends. It all started when Jake, our tech whiz, stumbled upon this weird ad on the dark web. We'd been playing soccer together since we were kids, and even though we weren't pros, we were pretty damn good. Anyway, Jake found this ad that promised a $50,000 prize for a soccer tournament. It sounded too good to be true, but we were broke, and the thought of that money was just too tempting. Jake showed us the ad one night when we were hanging out at our usual spot, a crummy bar near our neighborhood. The ad was super simple. $50,000 soccer tournament, teams of 5, winner takes all, click for details. We were all like, hell yeah, and decided to go for it. I mean, what's the worst that could happen, right? So, we clicked on the link, and it took us to this sketchy website that looked like it was straight out of the 90s. No fancy graphics, just plain text and a button that said register your team. We hesitated for a second because it seemed a bit off, but the money was calling our names. We filled out our team's details and hit submit. Almost immediately, we got an email confirming our registration. It had a location and time for our first match, along with a creepy disclaimer. Failure to appear will result in severe consequences. We laughed it off, thinking it was just a scare tactic to make sure people showed up. How wrong we were. The night before the tournament, we met up to talk strategy, but things felt different. There was this weird tension in the air that none of us could shake. Even Jake, usually the jokester, was quieter than usual. We did a round of shots to calm our nerves, but it didn't help much. Something just felt off. The day of the tournament, we drove out to this old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place looked like it hadn't seen life in years. As we parked and got out, a feeling of dread washed over us. This definitely wasn't a normal soccer field. We walked inside and were greeted by these men in dark suits. Their faces were hidden in the shadows, but their eyes were cold and creepy. One of them introduced himself as Mr. Black and handed us a contract. It was full of legal mumbo-jumbo we couldn't understand, but we signed it anyway. We were already there, and the money was too tempting to walk away from. Mr. Black led us further into the warehouse, where there was a makeshift soccer field marked out on the dusty floor. Our opponents were already there, and they looked just as nervous as we felt. Mr. Black explained the rules. Standard soccer, no fouls, no timeouts. The only weird rule was that the game would go on until one team scored 5 goals. The winner would take home the $50,000. We started playing, and at first it was pretty normal. Both teams were feeling each other out, trying to find weaknesses. But then things started getting weird. The air in the warehouse got heavy, like it was hard to breathe. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and it got colder and colder until we could see our breath. And then we started hearing whispers. At first they were faint, like someone was talking just out of earshot, but they got louder and louder until it was all we could hear. The whispers were in some language we didn't understand, sounding angry and harsh. Suddenly, one of the guys on the other team dropped to his knees, clutching his head and screaming. His teammates tried to help, but he started convulsing, his body twisting in ways that shouldn't be possible. Within minutes, he was dead, his face frozen in a look of pure terror. We wanted to run, but the men in suits blocked the exits. Mr. Black stepped forward and said, "The game must continue. You signed the contract." We were trapped. We had no choice but to keep playing. As we played, the whispers got worse, drilling into our minds. We started seeing things, horrible things, dead bodies, blood, and shadows that seemed to reach out for us. It was like we were in a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. Eventually, we managed to score the final goal. We collapsed in relief, but we didn't feel like winners. Mr. Black came forward, clapping slowly. "Congratulations," he said, his voice icy. "You've won the tournament." He handed us a briefcase full of cash, but it didn't feel real. We just wanted to get out of there. We stumbled out of the warehouse, swearing never to speak of what happened. But the nightmares followed us. We couldn't sleep, and when we did, the whispers were there, haunting us. Then, one by one, my friends started disappearing. First Jake, then Tom. Now it's just me. and I know they're coming for me too. I'm writing this to warn anyone who might be tempted by easy money. Some things aren't worth the cost. Some games should never be played. So after we left that creepy warehouse, we all tried to get back to our normal lives, but it was impossible. Every night I'd lie in bed and see those guys in suits and that dead dude from the other team. And the whispers, man, they were the worst. They were always there, even when I was awake. A week after the tournament, Jake went missing. At first, we thought he just needed some time alone. He had a habit of disappearing for a few days, but after a week, we started to worry. We went to his place and found the door wide open. Inside, everything was a mess, like someone had torn the place apart. There was no sign of Jake, just a creepy note written on the wall in what looked like blood. The game isn't over. We were freaked out, but what could we do? Calling the cops seemed pointless. What were we going to say? Hey, we played a soccer game and now our friend's missing? They'd laugh us out of the station. So we decided to stick together and hope for the best. A few days later, Tom went missing too. We were all hanging out at my place, trying to keep each other sane. Tom went out to grab some beers and never came back. We searched everywhere, but he was gone, just like Jake. We were seriously scared now. After Tom, it was just me, Mike, and Sam left. We were too scared to be alone, so we started staying at the same house, taking turns keeping watch. But even then, the whispers would find us. They'd start soft, like someone talking just out of earshot, then get louder until we couldn't hear anything else. It was like they were inside our heads. One night, it was my turn to keep watch. Mike and Sam were asleep, and I was sitting on the couch trying to stay awake. Then the whispers started again, louder than ever. I looked around, but there was nothing. Suddenly, I saw a shadow move across the room. It was too fast to be a person. I jumped up, but before I could do anything, the lights went out. When the lights came back on, Sam was gone. Mike and I searched the house, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. We found another note on Sam's bed. It said, "You can't hide." Mike and I were losing it. We knew we had to do something. We couldn't just wait around to be picked off one by one. We decided to go back to the warehouse. Maybe we'd find some answers there, something to help us understand what was happening. The drive back to the warehouse felt like forever. Mike didn't say a word the whole way, just gripping the steering wheel like his life depended on it. When we got there, the place looked even worse than before. We walked inside, and that same feeling of dread hit us. We searched the whole place but found nothing. No men in suits, no whispers, just silence. Then, in the middle of the empty field, we saw 5 soccer jerseys. Our jerseys. And underneath them was the briefcase with the prize money. We opened the briefcase and it was empty. There was a note inside. It said, "The game never ends." Just then we heard footsteps. We turned around and there they were, the men in suits. Their faces were still hidden in shadows. Mr. Black stepped forward and smiled. "You thought you could escape," he said. "The game is forever. You belong to us now." We tried to run, but it was like running through mud. The whispers were back, louder than ever, and the shadows seemed to reach out and grab us. I don't know how we made it out, but we did. We ran and didn't stop until we were miles away. After that, Mike and I went our separate ways. We didn't talk about what happened, didn't stay in touch. We just tried to move on, but the whispers never left. I still hear them, even now. They're getting louder again, and I know it's only a matter of time before they come for me too. If you're reading this, take my advice and stay away from stuff that seems too good to be true. Anyway, after Mike and I split up, things got worse. I thought maybe the whispers would stop if we weren't together, but I was wrong. They followed me everywhere. I tried to get back to my routine. I went to work, hung out with some other friends, but nothing felt right. I was always on edge, always waiting for something bad to happen. The nightmares got worse too. Every night I'd dream about that warehouse, those men in suits, and that poor guy who died right in front of us. About a month after the warehouse incident, Mike called me. I hadn't heard from him since we split up, and he sounded worse than I felt. He told me he couldn't take it anymore, that the whispers were driving him insane. He was seeing things too, shadows that moved on their own, faces in the dark. He begged me to come over. When I got to Mike's place, he looked terrible. He hadn't slept in days, and he was jumpy, like he was expecting something to jump out at him at any moment. We talked for hours, trying to figure out what to do. We thought about going to the police, but what could we say that didn't make us sound crazy? As we were talking, the whispers started again, louder and more insistent than ever. We both froze, listening. It was like they were right in the room with us. Mike grabbed my arm and whispered, "Do you hear that?" I nodded, too scared to speak. Then the lights went out. Just like before, we were plunged into darkness, and I could feel Mike's grip on my arm tighten. The whispers were deafening now, and I could see shadows moving all around us. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the front door flew open. We both screamed and ran out of the house, not stopping until we were far away. After that night, I didn't hear from Mike again. I went back to his place a few days later, but it was empty. No sign of him, just like Jake and Tom and Sam. Another note on the wall, same message. The game isn't over. I was alone now. The whispers were my constant companions, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they came for me too. I started researching anything that might explain what was happening. I spent hours online, looking for stories similar to ours. I found a few, but nothing that really helped. Just more tales of people disappearing, more whispers in the dark. One night I stumbled upon a forum post that caught my eye. It was from someone who claimed to have survived a similar experience. They talked about a secret organization that ran these games, recruiting people through the dark web and using them for some twisted form of entertainment. The poster said the only way to escape was to confront the organization head-on. I didn't have much to lose at this point, so I decided to follow the lead. The post had a location, a remote cabin in the woods where the organization supposedly had a base. It was a long shot, but I had to try. I packed a bag and drove out to the location. The cabin looked abandoned, but I could feel eyes on me as soon as I stepped out of the car. The whispers started up again, louder than ever. I took a deep breath and walked up to the door, knocking hard. To my surprise, the door creaked open. Inside, it was dark and musty, but I could see a faint light coming from a room at the back. I made my way through the cabin, the whispers growing louder with each step. So I walked into that room, and there he was, Mr. Black, sitting at a desk like he was expecting me. He looked up and gave me this creepy smile. "I knew you'd come," he said. His voice was calm, like he was talking about the weather or something. I was scared, but I tried not to show it. "Where are my friends?" I asked. "What do you want from us?" Mr. Black leaned back in his chair, still smiling. "Your friends are gone. They played the game and lost, just like you will." Anger bubbled up inside me. "What is this? Why are you doing this?" He sighed, almost like he was bored. "Entertainment, for those who can afford it. There are people out there who enjoy watching others suffer. It's quite lucrative." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You ruin lives for money? For fun?" "Exactly," he said, nodding. "And you've been quite the entertainer. You've lasted longer than most." The whispers were getting louder, and I could see shadows moving around the room. I knew I had to do something, but I felt frozen. "How do I stop this?" I asked, my voice shaking. Mr. Black's smile disappeared. "You can't. The game never ends. You belong to us now." I couldn't accept that. I wouldn't. I gathered all my courage and lunged at him, knocking him to the floor. We struggled, and I managed to grab a heavy lamp from the desk and smash it over his head. He went limp, and for a moment, The whispers stopped. I searched the room looking for anything that could help. In one of the drawers, I found a stack of files. Each one had a name and a picture, my friends, and many others. There were notes about each of us detailing our every move. At the bottom of the stack, I found my file. Inside, there was a map with several locations marked. One of them was circled in red. I grabbed the map and ran out of the cabin, not stopping until I was back in my car. I didn't know what I'd find at the marked location, but it was my only lead. The whispers started again as I drove, but I tried to ignore them, focusing on the road ahead. After hours of driving, I arrived at an old abandoned factory. The place looked even worse than the warehouse. The windows were broken and the whole building seemed like it was about to fall apart. But I knew I had to go in. I pushed open the rusty door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and every step echoed through the empty halls. I followed the map, making my way deeper into the building. The whispers grew louder with each step, but I kept going. Finally, I reached a large room at the back of the factory. In the center of the room was a huge cage, and inside were my friends, Jake, Tom, and Sam. They looked terrible, like they hadn't eaten or slept in days. They saw me and started shouting, but I couldn't hear them over the whispers. I ran to the cage and tried to open it, but it was locked. I looked around for something to break the lock and found a heavy piece of metal. I started smashing the lock with all my strength, and after what felt like forever, it finally broke. Jake, Tom, and Sam stumbled out of the cage, looking at me with a mix of relief and fear. "We need to get out of here," I said, and they nodded. As we made our way back through the factory, the whispers grew louder, almost like they were angry. Shadows moved around us, and the temperature dropped. It felt like we were being chased by something we couldn't see. We finally made it out of the factory and into the car. I floored the gas, and we sped away, not looking back. The whispers started to fade, but I knew we weren't safe yet. We drove for hours, trying to put as much distance between us and that place as possible. Eventually, we found a motel and decided to stop for the night. We were exhausted, but none of us could sleep. We kept hearing the whispers, faint but still there, a constant reminder that the game wasn't over. As we sat in the motel room trying to figure out our next move, we knew one thing for sure. We had to find a way to end this once and for all. The game might never end, but we had to fight back. We had to. It was the only way to survive. We sat in that motel room, exhausted and scared. None of us could sleep, so we spent the night talking about what to do next. We knew running wasn't an option. The whispers would always find us, and we couldn't live like that. We had to end this once and for all. The map I found in the cabin had other locations marked. We figured these were more places connected to the game. We decided to check them out, hoping to find something that could help us stop this nightmare. The closest location was another abandoned building, an old hospital about an hour's drive away. Early the next morning, we packed up and headed out. The drive was tense, but we tried to keep each other calm. We talked about normal things like old times to keep our minds off the fear, but deep down we all knew this was it. This was our last shot. When we got to the hospital, it looked just as creepy as the warehouse and the factory. Broken windows, overgrown weeds, and an eerie silence. We walked inside, sticking close together. The whispers started almost immediately, but we tried to ignore them. We explored the hospital, looking for anything that might help. We found old medical equipment, dusty files, and broken furniture, but nothing useful. Just as we were about to give up, Jake found a hidden door behind a large cabinet. It was heavy, but we managed to push it open. Behind the door was a staircase leading down to a basement. The whispers were deafening now, and the air was freezing. We knew whatever we were looking for was down there. We descended the stairs, our flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. At the bottom, we found a large room filled with computer equipment and monitors. It looked like some kind of control center. On the screens, we saw live feeds from hidden cameras. Some were in the factory, some in the warehouse, and some in other places we didn't recognize. They were watching everything. In the middle of the room was a large control panel. with a single button marked Terminate. It seemed too good to be true, but we had no other option. We gathered around the panel, our hands shaking. "Are we sure about this?" Tom asked, his voice barely audible over the whispers. "We have to try," I said. "It's our only chance." We all nodded, and Jake reached out to press the button. As soon as he did, the monitors flickered and went dark. The whispers stopped instantly, replaced by an eerie silence. We looked at each other, hardly daring to believe it was over. Suddenly, the room was flooded with light, and a group of men in suits, including Mr. Black, entered. "Well done," Mr. Black said, clapping slowly. "You've completed the game." "What are you talking about?" I demanded. "We ended it." Mr. Black smiled that same cold smile. "You may have shut down this operation, but the game never truly ends. There are other locations, other players, but you've earned your freedom, for now." We didn't trust him, but we had no choice. The men escorted us out of the hospital and into the daylight.